Our story begins in the city of Ale, which served as the last stronghold of humanity. Its defenders lay defeated and broken, and then a monstrous explosion tore through the very heart of the capital. The shockwave rolled across the battlefield, destroying everything that remained of the city's defenses. Amid the smoldering ruins, a lone warrior struggled to his feet, gasping for air. However, from the clouds of smoke in front of him, a figure suddenly appeared, who declared that he was the only survivor. A sword made of hot, pure flame flared up in the monster's hand. The demonic creature then, with a cruel grin, called out his final opponent's name, Colin Hall. The exhausted warrior found himself cornered and seemingly without hope. However, even wounded and barely able to stand on his feet, Colin felt fury. The monster was amused by the fact that the main character continued to fight even after he became the last remaining warrior. Moreover, he mockingly suggested that his last opponent should choose for himself how he would like to die. However, Colin could only stare at him, trying to figure out if it was really over. At this moment, despair finally began to take hold of the hero. Then his thoughts suddenly went back a year, to the day when the demonic race invaded the human world. The ordinary human soldiers fought with all their might, but were no match for the demons who used magic. The reason for this one-sided massacre lay in the terrible secret of magic itself. It was a power that was kept to itself by the nobility, as only people of noble birth could use it. Confident that they were the heroes, the aristocrats gathered together to cast their greatest spell. They were convinced that their power alone would be enough to save all of humanity. So with this confidence, they unleashed a destructive torrent of magic on the burning city below. However, the nobles could not even imagine that demonic figures would emerge from the smoke after this attack without receiving a single wound. Their greatest spell, considered the pinnacle of their power, turned out to be nothing more than child's play for the invaders. Moreover, the magic that the nobility were so proud of was stopped by one demon without much effort using a barrier. The entire human elite could only watch in absolute horror as their last hope was completely destroyed. Colin's mind's eye again saw the city engulfed in uncontrollable flames. The hero remembered the bodies of his fallen comrades and was tormented by one single, unbearable regret. If only he could find that mysterious book earlier, he would have the opportunity to change their fate. However, this thought brought him back to the present moment, where the boy was again on his knees after a brutal battle. His opponent towered over him and mockingly asked how Colin would prefer to end his life. He said he wouldn't mind cutting off his limbs or burning him to ashes like his comrades. But instead of giving up, the protagonist decided that he had no choice but to unleash his hidden power. His opponent was stunned by the sudden resistance. Meanwhile, Colin tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, tired of the demon's taunts. Then, with a furious cry, he rushed forward and went on the attack, intending to silence the enemy. However, his blade collided with the wall of fire created by his opponent without the slightest difficulty, and was stopped. The next moment, a sudden scream came out of Colin's mouth. He screamed and began to push forward, using all the strength that was left in him. The demon, however, suppressed his onslaught without much effort. Colin gritted his teeth, but he still had no intention of giving up. He moved his sword sharply and thrust it straight into his opponent's chest. He planted his feet firmly on the ground and prepared for the collision. He asked Colin contemptuously if he really thought he could be defeated by ordinary human swordsmanship. With a sadistic smile, he maliciously reminded that humanity would receive no mercy from the demonic god. However, his confidence was instantly shattered when a sudden sharp pain caused him to cry out in surprise. The demon growled in disbelief, unable to comprehend how a human blade had managed to wound him in the first place. Colin then explained that it would indeed be impossible to deliver such a blow with an ordinary sword. However, the moment his hands began to glow blue, it became clear that this was no ordinary technique being used. The hero pointed out that the forbidden blade that used the soul as payment was a completely different story. With this last desperate attempt, Colin rushed towards the demon, ready to sacrifice absolutely everything. Their swords clashed in a flurry of attacks, neither of them ready to give in to the other. Colin held his position with all his might, and then he noticed a single, desperate gap in the enemy's defense. He instantly lunged forward, cutting off his opponent's arm and causing him to cry out in pain. The horned man became enraged, his face distorted with anger. However, even after receiving the wound, he continued to mock the so-called forbidden technique. The demon noted dismissively that such a move would only work in the event of a surprise attack. Suddenly, Colin's expression turned to horror as his weapon began to crack and shatter in his hands. The demon stated that Colin was just one step away from victory. At that very moment, the weapon completely shattered into a multitude of glowing fragments. Left defenseless, the boy could only watch as the clawed hand approached his face. After this, a gigantic explosion of demonic energy occurred, which completely engulfed the hero. When the destructive force finally dissipated, Colin lay on the ground, broken and motionless. Having given everything he had, the hero admitted that even his greatest technique was not enough to save humanity. He could only grit his teeth in rage as his vision gradually blurred with pain. Suddenly, the enemy grabbed Colin by the collar and lifted him off the ground. He noted contemptuously that even a life-and-death struggle had proven to be completely pitiful. As life began to leave his body, Colin saw before him the images of his fallen comrades. In his last moments, he seemed to whisper to them his final apology for failing. The demon grinned widely and triumphantly, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. Then he lifted Colin's body without much difficulty. His blood spattered onto the old book, covering it with red drops, but the spilled blood did more than just stain the cover. She activated an ancient glowing magic circle that had previously been hidden inside the book. Instead of meeting death, Colin suddenly came to his senses. He couldn't understand how he had ended up alive at all. Then the protagonist stood up and found himself alone in a completely unfamiliar void. Colin tried to figure out where exactly he was, but before he could find an answer, a mysterious voice suddenly called his name. Startled, Colin immediately assumed a defensive stance and demanded to know who it was. Then his eyes widened in shock as something amazing suddenly appeared right in front of him. A mysterious ancient book materialized from the darkness, glowing with incredibly powerful magical energy. Colin immediately recognized the legendary artifact and whispered that it was a magic book in front of him. However, then the book itself spoke to him and explained that it was his blood that had called it to help him fix everything and start over. The hero realized that if what was happening was really true, he had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to change everything. Then he turned to the mysterious voice, saying that he did not know who he was. However, he was very interested in starting over. For Colin, this was an opportunity he could never have dreamed of. The mysterious voice was satisfied with this answer and said that it would help Colin fulfill his long-standing desire. The book promised to grant him 3 forgotten master-level abilities. After this, a blinding light flashed around him, and the promised power began to manifest. He stood before the open ancient tome, preparing to accept the power that would allow him to rewrite his own history. Finally, the book turns once again to Colin Hall. She demanded that he prove his worth. A mysterious force promised him a completely different future, channeling the ancient magic of the artifact through him. However, when the hero opened his eyes, he heard the roar of the crowd, who were enthusiastically chanting the name of the monster known only as the Butcher. Colin frantically tried to understand what had happened and what reality he found himself in. It turned out that he had been thrown into a slave arena, where the gladiator was forced to fight against a huge champion. The guy only had a cheap sword and shield in his hands, so his chances of survival seemed practically zero. The Butcher wasted no time and brought down his giant hammer, intending to end the fight in one blow. Colin gritted his teeth, realizing that this was the first test that his second attempt at living life would bring him. Yet somehow he withstood the devastating attack, leaving the entire crowd in stunned silence. High in the stands, Viscount Slate watched the proceedings with utter disdain. He said mockingly that commoners were worth absolutely nothing. In his eyes, fighters like Colin were no different from slaves who were born only to die for his amusement. When the hammer came down again, the crowd only burst into louder laughter, but the hero remained calm. The impact sent large clouds of dust rolling across the arena. The entire arena went wild, chanting the name of their champion, the Butcher. The nobles watched what was happening with sadistic pleasure. They waited impatiently for the final blow. When the rising dust finally settled, it appeared as if the fighter's body lay motionless on the ground. And then one viewer suddenly realized a shocking truth. It was the Butcher who was kneeling, his huge hammer imprinted on the ground. The champion himself could not understand how his most powerful attack was stopped so easily. Then Colin realized that he had indeed returned to the past and was once again confronted by the gladiator who had once tormented him. He began to wonder if the ancient magic book had truly merged with his soul. If the newfound power was indeed real, Colin decided to test his theory. Then he took a step forward. He then swung his sword powerfully, and the blade erupted in blue aura. After this, the guy rushed forward and shouted that from that moment on, he was going to rewrite his own destiny. The Butcher could only watch in horror at how fast his opponent was. In an instant, Colin cut off his opponent's head before he could do anything. The Butcher's giant body fell lifelessly to the ground, and Colin landed right in front of him. For Colin, however, this was only the first step. The crowd, which had recently been enthusiastically supporting the champion, could now only look at the arena in absolute horror. Now the hero had to master a new power in order to save humanity from total destruction in the future. As a slave, he could only consider his dreams as fantasy. First, he had to take one crucial step. The hero looked up at the powerful nobles in whose hands his life lay. He swore to himself that he would definitely end up in the Hall family. It was led by Marquis Darius Hall. This time, with the knowledge from his past life, Colin was determined to achieve his goals even faster. He remembered one desperate conversation with an elderly man. He told him that the commoners had put everything on Colin, hoping that he would be the one to defeat the nobles' champion. However, the old man, overcome with fear, admitted that he could not disobey Viscount Slate, who controlled the arena. With tears in his eyes, he begged Colin to simply lose the fight, because his victory would mean inevitable execution for the old man himself. Now the protagonist understood that Slate had always seen him as nothing more than a pawn that could be used for the amusement of the nobles. However, Colin was going to turn their game against them. He intended to turn this spectacle into his own ticket to power. Then the guy turned around and demanded that the next opponent be brought. From the VIP box, one nobleman, in a rage, slammed his fist on the table with all his might. They raised quite a fuss, shouting indignantly that the butcher should have won in a rigged fight. They had just lost huge fortunes by betting their money on a predetermined outcome of a fight. Slate desperately tried to calm the chaotic crowd and insisted that everything that was happening was part of a plan. At this point, Marquis Darius Hall calmly asked his assistant to evaluate the boy's last blow. The assistant admitted that the cut was incredibly precise and exceeded even the capabilities of an imperial soldier. The Marquis chuckled and admitted that he had found it quite amusing to see the boy challenge Viscount Slate. Meanwhile, down in the arena, a new opponent was immediately released against Colin. Slate wanted to give the nobles a little thrill and get them to open their wallets again. So he hastened to reassure the angry nobles that everything was still going according to plan. Slate vowed that Colin would be torn apart for this humiliation. However, the crowd had already begun chanting the name of the new champion, admiring his incredible victory. The Viscount could only watch in complete disbelief, realizing that his plan was rapidly falling apart. The enraged nobles immediately surrounded him and demanded to know whether they had really been deceived. The man himself did not understand what this slave was thinking about. In a desperate attempt to rectify the situation, Slate ordered his men to round up all the gladiators in the arena. However, Darius Hall just chuckled, finding what was happening truly interesting. Within moments, a small army of fighters had been assembled, ready to enter the battle. Colin remembered his past life, in which he failed to realize the Marquis's dream of an equal world. He now understood that in order to join the Hall family, he had to earn the Marquis's favor. But the hero realized that simply defeating these gladiators would not be enough. Then Colin raised his sword and challenged the entire army of gladiators, demanding that they attack him simultaneously. The crowd erupted in shouts, some calling Colin mad, while others, on the contrary, demanded that he kill them all. The first challenger, a huge brute, growled and stepped forward, accepting the challenge. However, Colin only exhaled sharply, and his gaze turned cold as the entire angry crowd rushed at him at once. However, all their attacks failed to reach their target, as the hero dodged them in time. His opponents looked at him in surprise, considering such speed completely impossible. Then Colin looked over his shoulder and prepared to respond to their attack. With one smooth movement, the main character killed two fighters at once. However, the fight was not over yet. The remaining gladiators gave a last desperate battle cry and rushed forward again. However, Colin calmly deflected the huge spiked mace with a simple kick. The hero then delivered a blindingly fast blow with his sword and cut through the wave of attacking gladiators. Two more fighters fell under his attacks. However, the last and most heavily armored gladiator roared and brought down a huge sword from above. However, the main character still remained extremely calm and only prepared to repel the attack. At the right moment, he intercepted his opponent's weapon with his bare hand. He stopped it with just 2 fingers, then threw his spear at it, which tore through its body. The spectators watched in horror as Colin's weapon flew right over their heads and flew somewhere further. At that moment, Slate realized that the blade was flying straight at him. Before he could do anything, the weapon pierced the wall just a few centimeters away from him. The man froze in horror when he realized that just a little more and the attack would have landed right on his face. He stared in horror at the bloody blade that was still sticking out of the wall, unable to utter a word. Meanwhile, the protagonist remained absolutely calm as his opponent was defeated, his weapon falling on his leg. Colin picked it up quite calmly and looked at the nobles with a grin. He looked up and looked straight at Slate, waiting for his reaction. The man shouted at him, asking him how he dared to humiliate him, and promised that he would definitely make him pay for it. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate among the other nobles, and then they heard someone laughing nearby. It turned out it was Darius. He said that the pawn became a player, and the fisherman became a fish. Slate's plans were ruined. The other nobles told him that he had acted as if it did not concern him, and said that the slave should be given the death penalty. However, when Darius heard this, a very cold expression appeared on his face. He asked if it was the common sense of the nobles to look down on others. At this moment, all the other nobles froze, not knowing what to answer to these words. And then suddenly Slate struck the ground with his staff and asked if he was still pursuing false ideals. After that, he began to form a ball of magical energy in his hand. He said that 1,000 years ago, at the time when their ancestors received magic from God, a clear hierarchy emerged in this world. They, as nobles, had become the viceroys of God, and yet even now they continued to cling to their erroneous beliefs. So Slate challenged him and asked him if he was really going to confront their great God. When Colin, who was already there, heard these words, a grin appeared on his face. He turned to Slate and asked him what was wrong with that. The other nobles immediately started shouting, asking how he dared to mess with God and why there was a slave there in the first place. However, the protagonist ignored these accusations and addressed Viscount Slate directly, pointing his weapon at him. He said that if he really was God's viceroy, then he should have fought with him instead of God. Everyone was horrified that the slave had actually decided to challenge Slate, and they said that Colin had gone mad. The other nobles laughed, saying that all he could do was pray that he wouldn't be killed. However, Darius watched what was happening with an incredibly calm and focused expression on his face. Viscount Slate looked down on the boy, still considering him nothing more than a lowly slave. Filled with rage, he declared that Colin had mocked God and ruined his plans. After that, he released a powerful stream of magic and asked if a common slave really considered himself worthy of a duel. However, as the attack approached, a mysterious voice sounded in Colin's mind, the power of an ancient magic book. A window of characteristics suddenly appeared before the hero's eyes, showing that the Viscount's parameters were weak. The enraged Viscount prepared his next attack and promised to fulfill Colin's wish to die. However, he only watched him calmly, maintaining a cold and completely unimpressed expression on his face. With a final cry, Slate unleashed his greatest spell and vowed to send the hero to the next world. The nobles watching the scene, Darius, were astonished to recognize the deadly spell Windblade. The other aristocrats merely smirked and began to place bets on how many parts of the slave would remain after the attack. A veritable whirlpool of the sharpest wind magic rushed forward, intending to tear its target to pieces. Viscount Slate cried out that this was meant to demonstrate the absolute difference in power between a commoner and a nobleman. However, Colin remained completely unperturbed, calmly analyzing the enemy's seemingly insignificant strength. Colin instantly realized that such a basic-level spell could do him no harm at all. A grin appeared on his face as the boy realized how useful the power of the magic book could actually be. A vortex of wind swirled around his body, completely neutralized by the hero's mere presence. Colin then spread his arms wide and declared that compared to the magic of the demon race, this pathetic performance was worth nothing at all. Slate screamed in disbelief as his greatest attack failed completely. The watching nobles, including the powerful Marquis of Hall, were completely stunned by this incredible turn of events. But before anyone could react, Colin rushed forward and in an instant closed the distance between himself and the Viscount. A terrified Slate drew his own sword and screamed that it was impossible. However, he didn't even have time to draw his weapon from its sheath before the hero jumped on him. With one deft swing of his sword, he knocked the weapon out of his opponent's hands. A bead of sweat rolled down the Viscount's face as he finally realized the true gulf between their powers. The next moment, the cold blade of Colin's sword was already pressed tightly against his throat. The duel was over before it had even truly begun. However, as soon as victory was secured, the protagonist's senses sharply heightened, he noticed a sudden surge of unfamiliar magic. A strange purple energy appeared right under his feet, which caught even Colin off guard. The mysterious energy began to thicken and turned into skeletal hands that tied the boy up. He tried to understand what this force was. The hero screamed in pain as the shadow limbs completely immobilized him, wrapping around his face and body. It was at this moment that a detachment of warriors arrived, announcing that they had come in response to the report received. Their commander looked sternly at the captured slave and accused him of defying the nobility and insulting God. In the name of God, the soldiers surrounded Colin and declared him under arrest, pointing their blades at him. Trapped, the hero could only stare back coldly as the situation spiraled out of control. However, he recognized his opponents. They were divine guardians, a force that was extremely dangerous to tangle with. This elite unit served the magic tower, which was tasked with maintaining the authority of God and the supremacy of noble blood. It was mainly composed of powerful nobles, and their strength far exceeded that of any ordinary knight. Yet, even when faced with such power, Colin only grinned, confident that it would be easy to break these magical bonds. He began to resist the binding spell, realizing that he couldn't allow its true power to be noticed yet. However, the guy had no other choice, and then he realized that everything was decided on the principle of all or nothing. So with a mighty roar, Colin broke the magical bonds and revealed his true identity. He shouted that he was Colin Hall, son of Marcus Darius. The elite divine guards were completely stunned, realizing that they had just attacked a high-ranking noble. Viscount Slate's face twisted in shock. He couldn't believe that the slave he had tortured for so long belonged to the Hall family. Immediately, distrustful whispers spread through the crowd, since no one had ever heard before that the Marcus had another son. Colin just chuckled, watching the chaos that had ensued and wondering how the guards were now going to correct their mistake. However, the commander did not believe his words. He accused the guy of making up his status just to save his own life. The enraged Viscount joined in the accusations and shouted that for such a deception he deserved 10,000 deaths. But just as the guards were about to strike, Darius's commanding voice thundered over the arena, demanding a halt. Marquis Darius descended into the arena. Viscount Slate was seething with rage, because he only had a few moments left to finish off the impudent fool. However, the Marquis did not try to save his son at all, and instead grabbed Colin with force, accusing him of disgracing the family name. The divine guards could only watch in complete confusion, completely unable to understand what was happening. Even Viscount Slate was stunned as he watched his entire plan unravel into complete chaos before his very eyes. The Marquise explained that it was he who had once sent Colin away, hoping that a harsh lesson would help him reform. The hero endured the humiliation while his body was still wrapped in magical arms. His father was furious that instead of learning his place, Colin had dared to challenge the Viscount. However, through the pain and rage, a confident grin appeared on the protagonist's face. He realized that his risky plan had worked. The guy admitted that this victory belonged to him. Still holding his son in one hand, Darius addressed the stunned Viscount Slate formally. He offered a personal apology for the trouble his foolish son had caused. However, Colin immediately exploded with indignation and declared that it was the Viscount who first insulted their family. However, the man immediately silenced his son. After this, the Marquis turned to the Divine Guardians and assured them that he would personally deal with this matter. Then he waved his hand dismissively, ordering everyone to leave him alone with his son. However, Viscount Slate shouted at them not to let the man go. Blinded by rage, he pointed his sword at the Marquis, accusing him of allowing himself to be deceived by a mere performance. All this time, Colin watched the chaos that he himself had created. Finally, Viscount Slate's mind completely went haywire, and he declared that he would finish off Colin right here and now, no matter what the cost. The nobleman, having lost control of himself, pointed his sword straight at Darius. But just as the situation reached its peak, Colin let out a quiet chuckle. He wondered if the Viscount's threat to kill anyone who got in his way also applied to the man standing in front of him. The hero then gestured towards his father, the revered Lord of the Rhine territory. He then asked if this threat even extended to the Divine Guardians, who had been sent to capture him in the name of God. Finally, Colin made the most serious accusation, asking whether Viscount Slate intended to start a rebellion. These words finally destroyed the Viscount's resolve. He dropped his sword in complete horror. The guard commander then quickly intervened and announced that the whole situation was a misunderstanding. He formally apologized to the Marquis for his rudeness. The man announced that the guards would now leave this place. However, before leaving, the commander turned to Viscount Slate with a gloomy expression on his face in order to deal with him. The commander of the Divine Guardians vowed to report everything that had happened to the powerful magic tower. Viscount Slate was removed and left to await his fate. With the immediate threat gone, Colin finally allowed himself to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. However, while the guards were leaving the arena, their commander continued to think about the mysterious warrior and decided to report about him in all details. One of his subordinates asked if he meant the Marquis's son. The knights wondered how the Lord of the Lane territory could have a secret child that no one knew about. The commander rejected this idea, stating that Colin could not possibly be the Marquis's real son. However, his incredible resistance to magic made them wonder why the Marquis was willing to risk everything to protect him. Unable to find an answer, the commander ordered his men to keep the boy under constant surveillance and report on his every move. Soon after, they headed towards the arena exit. Sometime after this, someone's carriage drove away from the city. As the carriage rumbled along the forest road, a triumphant laugh was heard from inside. Marquis Darius Hall praised Colin for his performance. There was a tense atmosphere inside the carriage, as Colin sat tensely opposite the father, who had only recently acknowledged him as his son. Finally, he broke the silence and formally thanked the Marquis for saving his life. Colin noted to himself that his freedom had already been purchased, meaning his life as a slave was officially over. However, the Marquis asked if he had ever been on a battlefield. He demanded to know how an ordinary boy could move with the precision of a seasoned warrior. Confused, the protagonist began to invent a story about a tragic past. He claimed that his own village sold him to a slave guild. However, then a certain nobleman took him in and taught him the basics of weapons and magic. The hero declared that this mysterious benefactor was like a real father to him. According to him, this man entrusted him with a great idea, but in the end he was unable to implement it. So this time, Colin was determined to live up to his expectations to the fullest. He declared that he would do this even if it cost him his life, which greatly surprised Marcus Darius. The man thought to himself that it meant Slate's attacks hadn't worked because Colin had learned the basics of magic. Now he had a strong heart that did not allow the flame of hope to go out, and despite any circumstances, Darius began to think that this young man might be able to make his ideals come true. At this moment, the Marquis's assistant suddenly pulled him out of his thoughts and turned his attention to him. The huge wheels of the carriage stopped with a heavy grinding sound. Before them loomed an incredibly large mansion, the true heart of the Hall family estate. The carriage entered a luxurious courtyard. Once outside, the Marquis turned to the boy and ordered him to follow him. Then he announced that Colin was no longer a slave, and the words hung heavily in the air. However, immediately after this, he warned his son that the newfound freedom did not mean peace or security. In a cruel world, the only law was the survival of the fittest, and so his help ended right on the steps of the mansion. From that moment on, Colin's ability to overcome the next great challenge became entirely his own concern. The boy stood silently in place with an inscrutable expression on his face, realizing the full weight of the task set before him. The Marquis then revealed his true motive and admitted that he had placed incredibly high hopes on this boy. Immediately after this, the man turned around and headed towards the entrance of the mansion, leaving the protagonist alone. Nobles married their equals to preserve the power of their magic and the purity of their bloodline. The Hall family is particularly obsessed with blood superiority, but Darius Hall was an exception, born to a servant. He was once subjected to severe discrimination because of his origin. However, through tireless efforts and overwhelming strength, he rose to the rank of Marquis. He eventually became the ruler of the Rhine territory, which was now known to absolutely everyone. As he and Colin walked down the corridor, the Marquis said that he didn't care what his past was. He explained that the past was completely irrelevant here. According to Darius, in this place, only strength was important. He stated that people here revered the wealth, status, and honor that a person had. Moreover, he promised the main character that he would give him absolutely everything he wanted. However, he will do this provided that he has enough ability to deserve it. The Marquis looked at him with a serious expression and asked Colin to remember this. Then the main character asked him if he would really give him absolutely everything he wanted. After this, he asked if he could give him the position of ruler if he wanted it. These words completely stunned the Marquis, and he froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. At some point, he thought about the main character's words about giving him the place of ruler, but then he suddenly laughed loudly, opened the doors he was standing in front of, and stepped inside. With a smile on his face, he said that even if he was so confident in himself, he could try to take this place away from him. At that moment, Colin thought about how Marquis Darius was a true proponent of meritocracy. The term meant equal opportunity for all, which is why Darius was hated by the blood supremacists. At that moment, their thoughts were interrupted by a female voice that appeared right in the hall where our heroes were standing. As soon as Darius heard him, he immediately turned around and looked at the people who had arrived. It was his eldest son, Freed, and his wife, Katrina Williams, who were also his enemies within his family. Darius was surprised that his wife met him because he had not told anyone that he was going to return back. Katrina replied that wherever he went, rumors spread quickly, and she also had her own birds. These words made her husband very angry, but the woman only laughed in response. Then Darius said that he was ready to swear that he was simply being followed by her personal spies. At that moment, the protagonist looked at Countess Katrina Williams, who was the ruler from the shadows. It was the woman who attempted his life and destroyed the Marquis's ideals. She inherited the title and all the property from her late parents and was considered equal to the first wife, despite being the second. Now she was plotting to make her son Fried the Marquis's heir, and in her past life, Colin had fallen into her trap. However, he was now determined to make amends, so he stepped forward and said that he was honored to see Katrina. He then introduced himself as Colin Hall and stated that from that day on, he would dedicate all his energies to serving the Hall family. When Fried heard this, a look of complete bewilderment appeared on his face. He asked the hero who he thought he was, but his mother calmly stopped him with a wave of her hand. She scornfully declared that Colin was nothing more than a lowly slave who used the surname of a nobleman. Immediately after this, she called her assistant, Cornell, to her. She turned to him and asked if he had neglected to train the newcomer. At that moment, the man had absolutely no idea what to answer. And then suddenly, the main character took his weapon out of its sheath and prepared for battle. He pointed his sword at Katrina and her son, saying that this surname was given to him by none other than the head of the family himself. After that, he asked if anyone here had any objections to his decision. Colin declared that one day he would become the ruler of this territory and make them all kneel before him. However, Katrina was not at all disturbed by these words, since they were spoken by an ordinary slave. At the same time, her son Freed was furious at what this pathetic slave was doing. Darius himself was the one who was most pleased with what was happening. He responded to Colin's words with a sly smile. The other servants began to whisper among themselves about Colin's claim that he would one day become ruler. Some laughed at him, saying that this slave was simply talking nonsense. At that moment, Katrina closed her eyes and sighed tiredly, clearly not wanting to listen to the servants' conversations. They understood everything without further ado, and immediately fell silent, but nevertheless continued to cast ambiguous glances at each other. Meanwhile, the main character maintained an absolutely calm expression on his face and continued to look at Katrina. The woman looked at him with contempt and declared that such a pathetic slave as he should not use his tongue like that. Immediately after this, all the maids and butlers grabbed their weapons, as if they had been waiting for this moment. They pointed their swords and clubs straight at the protagonist, and Katrina ordered them to seize him immediately. However, at this moment Darius himself intervened in the situation, ordering all the servants to stand still. Colin was very surprised that his father decided to stand up for him in such a situation. Darius stated that everything Colin said was true, and depending on his actual abilities, he was considering this option. When Freed heard that his father wanted to make Colin the ruler, he immediately rebelled and started shouting. He ran forward to his father and demanded that he explain what he was talking about. However, the man only gave him a very stern look, forcing the young man to shut up. At that moment, Katrina just laughed and said that if that was really the case, she wouldn't say anything else. However, she still had an ace up her sleeve, and she had no intention of hiding it. She stated that there were hundreds of servants on the Marquise's estate who worked themselves to the point of exhaustion. Yet only a few of them were ever given a surname at all. Most of those who were here were still considered low-born servants. So Katrina couldn't understand how a man who had just appeared out of nowhere had immediately earned the right to be called Hall. She approached the Marquis and asked him if he understood that not everyone would be happy with this. So instead of throwing around names so thoughtlessly, she suggested giving Colin a test instead. Katrina stated that he had to prove his strength to everyone's satisfaction, and if he failed, he had to leave the place. However, the protagonist responded by simply stating that this was completely unacceptable. Upon hearing this, Fright immediately shouted at him, suspecting that he was simply afraid of the duel. However, the main character stated that there was no point in him alone going through the tests. Everyone had to go through them, and the one who passed would receive the last name. The heir must be a truly capable person, not some loser who was just lucky enough to be born into the Hall family. Fried was completely shocked that this slave dared to mock him. It was the first time he had experienced such humiliation. He understood that if he really had to compete for the inheritance with servants and slaves, it would be a real shame. At that moment, his mother came up to him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. She hastened to reassure her son and said that she had already told him about this many times. According to her, a nobleman should remain graceful, so he shouldn't worry about some monkey. Moreover, Katrina stated that he had absolute magical power, which could not be said about this slave. So she asked her son to just sit and watch everything that was happening from above, as he was supposed to. Although Fried doubted that this was the right decision, he still agreed with his mother. In the end, Marquis Darius accepted Colin's offer, and it was decided that a selection test would be held among the volunteers in a month. Until then, he would have to work as a low-level servant, just like in his past life. However, Colin saw this as a great opportunity to study the grimoire that had given him this power. At that moment, the butler turned to him and said that it seemed that Colin knew very well how to please Lord Darius. He said that this man had noble ideals, and because of this, many other nobles were watching him. After that, he asked the main character if he had really been picked up by some nobleman. The butler noted that the people from the Slave Association said they bought Colin directly from a remote village. He also noted that this happened at the very moment when Lord Darius was worried about the lack of an heir. Right at that moment, a perfect candidate like Colin appeared. The butler then held a knife to Colin's throat and asked him if he thought it was too convenient to be a coincidence. The protagonist tried to justify himself and said that there was some logic in Mr. Cornell's words. However, those people from the Slave Association were the kind who would not hesitate to stage fake fights. They conspired with Slate and tried to extort money from him through betting. Colin asked the butler if he thought they would leave him alone after he obeyed their orders. The man thought that the merchant had said that Colin's strength was at most intermediate level, but his movements were clearly advanced. In swordsmanship and magic in the Empire, there were clear levels, with most people reaching the limit at the intermediate level. Most nobles focused on magic, so their swordsmanship was different at the basic level. However, in special organizations like the Divine Guardians, an advanced level of proficiency was required. At that moment, the man began to think that the merchant could actually have sold him false information so that he could get rid of Colin. The hero then noted that Cornell seemed to have figured it out and decided to help him dispel any doubts. He stated that if he were a spy, he would not have sought to become a local lord. Then the man decided to ask him what he meant. The hero explained that the spy's goal was to infiltrate the enemy's entourage and find his weaknesses. In other words, if he were a spy, he would be aiming for the Cornell position. At this point, the man pretended as if he had absolutely no idea what the young man was talking about. The hero noted that if he took the position of head butler, it would be easy for him to learn Master Darius' weaknesses. So he offered the man a deal. He would use his position as a servant to sniff out the spies of other nobles. At the same time, he wanted Mr. Cornell to cooperate with him, but the man said that this would make him enemies among the nobility. Colin replied that the great reward came with great risk, and that if something happened to the Marquis, there would be no point in the inheritance. The man realized that this guy was not just strong, he had a sharp enough mind to one day bear the weight of the crown. However, the assistant felt that something was wrong here, since the deal seemed too profitable for him at the moment. Then he decided to play along and agreed to show Colin his new quarters. The protagonist accepted the offer with a grin, realizing that his plan worked perfectly. Soon they arrived at a huge estate, which was the real center of the family's power. The assistant suggested that Colin choose any place he liked. He explained that the services of this house were divided into 3 ranks, which were established by Mrs. Katrina. The high-class servants served the mistress, the master, and the young master. Third-class servants could live in the mansion with them. But there were also lower-class servants who lived in separate barracks. Furthermore, lower-class servants were forbidden to even approach the mansion. Colin's main duties now included taking out the trash, chopping wood, and caring for the horses, and his pay was 3 copper coins a day. Finally, the butler decided to tell him the rules. In relation to the words of his elders, he had to show absolute submission. When the main character approached the barracks, he saw several strong men there who looked at him defiantly. They grinned when they saw the new servant and clearly understood that he would now be their errand dog. Before leaving, the butler said that these were the rules that the lady had personally established. Finally, he chuckled, clearly expecting Colin to be at a loss in this situation. However, the protagonist remained calm and took the butler's words into account. After this, he approached the men and introduced himself as Colin, saying that he was new. With a broad smile, he said that he would be very happy to work with all of them. However, when the other men heard this, they only laughed even louder and began repeating his name. They found it very funny that the future ruler himself personally came to them to help. One of the men approached him and said that he had heard that Colin had had a conflict with the lady and the young master. Another of them said that they would now teach him how to greet people here properly. After this, the third man picked up an empty bottle of alcohol and smashed it against the wall with all his might. He stated that Colin should get down on his knees right there and repeat that he was happy to work with them, while slapping himself. After this, the first man pointed his huge finger at the protagonist's face and asked him if he understood them. However, before he could finish his sentence, the protagonist grabbed his finger with all his strength. After that, he sharply twisted his arm back before the man had time to react in any way. The others were shocked when they saw the force with which Colin pushed their partner away. He then turned the man around to face him and kicked him in the chest with all his might, sending him flying. From such a strong blow, the man flew somewhere into the boards, broke them with his body, and was close to losing consciousness. At that moment, the protagonist came closer to him and declared that in that case, he would not hold back. He began slapping the man as hard as he could, repeating that he would be very happy to work with them. The other two just watched in horror at what Colin was doing to their friend. They were shocked that this brat was so strong and could afford such a thing. Therefore, they decided not to hesitate and kill him, grabbing a sharp bottleneck and a stool in their hands. However, the main character noticed that they were approaching him, so he lowered his hand in time and began to draw his sword from its sheath. He turned the scabbard towards one of the men, and the sword seemed to jump out of it on its own, hitting him right in the face. The man was thrown back by such a powerful blow, and blood gushed from the wounds on his face. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the protagonist jumped on top of the remaining man, who was holding a stool in his hands. He landed a powerful punch right across his face, sending him flying. From such force, he flew out of the door of the room they were in, straight into the street. At that moment, the second man finally came to his senses and carefully stood up, still holding his wounded face. At that moment, the main character approached him and lowered his sword right next to him. With a grim expression, he asked the man if he was satisfied with the way he had carried out their request. In response, he screamed and, frightened by the sharp blade right next to his face, said that he was very pleased. Hearing this, Colin turned around and said with a condescending smile that in that case, he was glad to hear it. However, the man immediately decided to take revenge on him and rushed to attack him. Grabbing a sharp bottleneck that was lying nearby, he decided to take revenge on this impudent guy. While Colin had his back to him, he took off running and rushed at him with all his might, screaming that he should die. The protagonist felt it, but instead of panicking, he only let out a tired sigh. Before the man got close enough, he swung his sword and cut off both of his hands. The blonde only watched in horror as his hands flew off somewhere to the side, still holding the bloody neck of the bottle. He screamed in pain and very heavy bleeding, while the main character remained completely calm. Then he turned around and asked him if he was happy now that things had come to this. As he stepped outside, Colin reflected on how he had so far managed to gain Mr. Cornell's trust, but it was unclear what would happen next. And then suddenly he decided to open his magic grimoire. The main character thought that he needed to learn magic in order to protect himself in the future. When Countess Katrina married Darius, she replaced most of the Hall family's servants with her own people and established a strict system. As a result, the relationship between them deteriorated even further, and against this background, Cornell, as the Lord's confidant, was appointed butler. Not only did he have the power to expel the Countess's confidants, he also had the privilege of participating in the selection of the successor. In other words, it was usually impossible to become an heir without his approval, but in his past life, Cornell faced an untimely death. As a result, Countess Katrina suddenly gained power and promoted her son Freed to the position of heir. Colin knew that if only Mr. Cornell had survived, things wouldn't have ended so badly for them. But in any case, with the hero's current entry-level magic resistance, he felt unsure. The book began to transmit forbidden knowledge to Colin. The information flowed directly into his consciousness, and soon he felt intense pain. Energy coursed through his body, making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain his composure. However, the guy continued to endure and tried to figure out what was happening. Suddenly, a vision of a powerful knight in armor appeared in his mind. It was a ghostly image that showed the limits Colin could reach in the future. However, gaining this power was not enough. He had to pass a test. The knight put a lot of pressure on him and forced him to submit. When the hero could hardly bear it any longer, a woman appeared in the vision and calmly offered to help him complete his first magical training. Colin was skeptical about this, wondering if origin was really all that mattered. However, instead of giving up, the boy decided to use this as a reason to become stronger. Mana began to gather around his hand, and Colin gradually forced it to obey his will. He then reached out to the ghostly knight, determined to see the test through to the end, no matter the consequences. The hero was determined to obtain this power for himself. Suddenly, a powerful stream of energy erupted from the servant's room, spreading throughout the estate and causing the building to shake. The next morning, 2 servants were working quietly, and then suddenly they noticed Colin approaching. This was the same guy they had been told to deal with earlier. The hero approached them and mockingly noted that they did not even try to kill him in his sleep. He then stated that any such attempt would have ended very badly for them. After that, the book showed his characteristics. His magic was low, but his swordsmanship was at the top level of a master. Seeing this, the guy realized that the test had indeed been successful. Now Colin was very tired and decided to find a place where he could have a proper meal. However, on the street his path was suddenly blocked by guards, who began to clear the way for some important person. The same servants who had previously mocked Colin were now afraid to raise their heads and were forced to bow. Suddenly, one of the guards rudely called out to a passerby. At this moment, one of the servants suddenly found himself in the middle of the road. He became confused and froze in front of the approaching procession, continuing to hold the bucket in his hands. The guard didn't hesitate to kick him and throw him aside as he blocked the way. The bucket fell to the ground and water spilled around. The lieutenant who was following behind tripped over the bucket and looked at his boot in irritation. His subordinate was immediately enraged by such disrespect, but the lieutenant calmly stopped him. The frightened servant began to ask for forgiveness. He explained that he was simply looking the other way and therefore did not notice the people. The lieutenant pretended to understand him and replied that nothing could be changed. The servant thanked him, not noticing the officer's expression. But then the lieutenant grabbed his face. He stated that if his eyes weren't looking where they needed to be, then he didn't need them at all. After this, he tore out the unfortunate servant's eye and he fell to the ground, bleeding. The people around were frightened and only quietly talked among themselves. Then the subordinate guard turned sharply to the crowd and demanded to know why everyone was looking at them. After this, he ordered everyone to kneel, forcing the servants to obey. Colin continued to stand in the middle of the street and calmly thought about what he wanted to eat. He paid almost no attention to the guards. Soon, a man with a bandaged arm and a scar ran forward. He began to hurriedly call out to his boss and then pointed at Colin. The man recognized him as the same madman who had once cut off his hand. The eye patch-wearing lieutenant looked at Colin and called out to him, wondering how the guy dared to ignore him. The hero just calmly turned around and offered to cut off their hands too, if they were friends of the man he had already injured. The lieutenant laughed, ran his bloody fingers over his face, and mockingly declared that this impudent guy didn't even understand who he was dealing with. Meanwhile, Colin was surrounded, and the lieutenant reminded him of the principle of an eye for an eye and asked if he was ready to suffer punishment. The boy then gripped the sword tighter and declared that now it would be up to him to decide what choice they would make. After this, Colin took out his weapon and asked them a simple question, asking if they wanted to keep their hands or their heads. The lieutenant just chuckled. He stated that he had no intention of personally fighting a boy like Colin. After this, the officer turned away and walked away, leaving the hero to deal with another enemy. At first, the main character didn't pay much attention to it, but when he saw who came out to him, his eyes widened in surprise. His opponent turned out to be none other than Dak, a former champion of the slave arena, as well as a reserve warrior of the guard and a mid-level servant. Colin could never have imagined that they would meet him in such a terrible place. He began to remember moments with his former comrade when they were still good friends. They often spent time playing various board games. They also participated in various battles together and defeated huge monsters. Their lives were literally intertwined with each other. At that moment, Colin noticed the wounds on Duck's body and realized that it looked like these guys had been beating him up just a second ago. Then he took his weapon in his hands and asked him if he was going to fight instead of this man. Duck replied that there were rules here. The younger ones obeyed the older ones, and the lower ones obeyed the middle ones, and those who broke the rules had to be punished. The hero asked if he was just going to swallow being used like that. It was hard for Daku to hear this, but he didn't respond to it. When Colin realized that he had touched the young man's soul, a smile appeared on his face. Taking advantage of the general confusion, he immediately rushed past him and struck him. The man whose hands the main character had recently cut off also didn't understand at all what had happened. And then suddenly the one-eyed lieutenant realized that Colin had run straight up to him and put a blade to his neck. He declared with a triumphant smile that he could only smash such rules to pieces. Everything happened so quickly that the lieutenant's subordinates didn't even have time to realize how the guy had appeared nearby. Only then did Duck realize that the whole scene had happened in literally an instant. Moreover, Colin managed to snatch his own sword and use it against the lieutenant. Finding himself in this situation, the lieutenant began to get nervous and tried to intimidate Colin with his influential connections. He revealed that he had been chosen by a mysterious divine messenger and that Colin had made an enemy of Sir Fried and the entire estate. However, Colin was not at all afraid. He continued to hold the blade to the lieutenant's throat and had no intention of retreating. But still, noticing the intent gazes of all the people gathered around him, he removed the blade from the lieutenant. The man said that it seemed like Colin was starting to understand how things worked here, but he couldn't just let him go. He turned to his subordinates and said that first he would beat him half to death. At that moment, his subordinates pulled out their swords and looked towards the protagonist with grins. After that, they approached Dak and hit him with their blades on his back with all their might, causing him unbearable pain. The main character froze in horror, not understanding why his friend deserved such punishment because he did nothing. The lieutenant laughed and stated that he needed to teach his subordinate a lesson before he could let him go. Meanwhile, Dak fell to his knees and trembled from incredible pain, with a bloody cross on his back from a double sword strike. But these scoundrels did not stop there. One of them plunged his sword straight into his palm, pinning it to the ground. He yelled at Duck that he had just missed a great opportunity and pressed the sword even harder into his hand. After that, he started threatening to do other things to him if he screwed up again. But the main character didn't let him finish, as he had already jumped on the men from behind, intending to stop them. At that moment, Duck noticed this and was very surprised, still not understanding why Colin was trying to help him. With one deft movement, the protagonist chopped off the heads of both men. Meanwhile, the lieutenant broke into a satisfied grin when he realized that Colin had just exposed his weak spot. He jumped on him from behind with a gun, declaring that he should not have turned his back on the enemy as a rookie. However, Colin reacted instantly and immediately struck him back with his weapon. As the lieutenant watched his weapon crumble into pieces, he froze briefly in surprise. Nothing remained of his sword except the hilt and a tiny remnant of the blade. Then the protagonist warned him that next time it would not be just a sword, but the lieutenant immediately shouted and asked him to stop. After that, he closed his eyes, already preparing himself for Colin to deal him the finishing blow. But at the last moment, he realized that something was wrong, and when he opened his eyes, he realized that Duck had protected him by standing in front of him. He repelled his attack with his sword. The protagonist jumped back from such an unexpected counterattack, still not understanding why Duck had stopped him. However, Dak did not fight of his own free will, and fending off the blows, shouted so that they would not add more sins to his conscience. Seeing that his old comrade really didn't want to fight, Colin decided to stop it. He made it clear to Duck that he would let him go this time, but there would be no other chance. After this, the hero turned to the remaining guards and demanded that they get out of his sight. Colin then turned to Duck again and asked why he, although stronger than him, refused to fight properly. Duck only tried to intimidate him, reminding him that disobeying the elder Colin would have resulted in death. However, instead of continuing the fight, Duck suddenly threw his sword into the air, abandoning the fight. Colin caught the weapon without difficulty and said that Duck could take it back since the sword only brought him bad luck. In the end, the main character was left alone and won the battle without shedding the blood of his former comrade. Later, the lieutenant became furious and shouted that Duck had made him look like a fool in front of everyone. He lowered his head into a trough of water, punishing him for his shame after the defeat. Then the lieutenant grabbed him by the hair and pulled him outside. Enraged by his subordinate's weakness, he contemptuously tossed Dak aside and ordered him out of his sight. One of the remaining guards hesitantly asked if they were really going to just let Colin leave. However, the lieutenant understood that this was not the end of it, and instead of continuing the battle directly, he decided to act differently. The man was planning to spread rumors that Colin had declared war on them in order to turn others against him and isolate him. Meanwhile, Colin's words from their fight continued to echo in Duck's head. He couldn't forget the question of why a warrior of his level refused to fight normally at all. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate, a large festive dinner had begun. Before eating, the servants prayed to the supreme god, asking for peace and remembering the mysterious man they called the divine messenger. While the ceremony was taking place, they discussed everyday matters, completely unaware of the showdowns that were taking place behind the walls of the estate. The servants then began to pray for peace again, and were reminded that they should be grateful for their situation. After this, they began to be given the usual modest portions of food. The line gradually moved forward, and the rude distributor called the next person each time. However, soon a new man appeared in the courtyard, and there was immediate silence among the servants. They recognized Colin Hall, the same guy who had recently dared to speak out against the lieutenant. Colin himself didn't seem to understand the reason for the general silence. He simply looked around and wondered why the entire courtyard had suddenly become silent. When the hero approached for his food and extended his hand, someone suddenly stopped him. The server pulled the plate away and declared that anyone who didn't work had no right to eat. It soon became clear to the hero that this was done on purpose. All the other servants also began to look at Colin with hostility. However, the guy had no intention of getting angry about this. He calmly stretched, as if what was happening didn't bother him at all. Those around him watched him in surprise and wondered where this outcast was going to go now. Colin headed straight for the private terrace where only the senior servants usually ate. Ignoring the existing order, he walked past the others and demanded that they give him way. The servants immediately became indignant and began shouting that someone should stop this slave. However, Colin didn't even pay attention to their words. He was only interested in the food in front of him. Then the main character calmly took the bun and bit off a large piece of it. Just at that moment, Assistant Cornell appeared. He explained to Colin that this part of the dining room was only for high-ranking servants. The others immediately demanded that Cornell punish the offender. However, the assistant remained calm. Instead of joining the others in their outrage, he called the incident a mistake and invited Colin to go with him. Everyone around fell silent, and it became obvious to everyone else that there was some kind of connection between Cornell and Colin. Outside the main estate, Cornell asked Colin if he had forgotten the rules of obedience. The hero rejected this accusation and explained that what happened was simply a misunderstanding. He then declared that he had sufficient skill to earn his own living, as the Lord had promised him. Cornell saw that Colin was not going to back down, so he formally offered to take him under his wing. However, in return, the assistant entrusted him with another, much more important task. There was a spy hiding inside the estate who posed a threat to the Marquis himself, and Colin had to find him. And it was at that moment that the sound of a hunting horn echoed across the estate. Cornell explained that there was a report from the dark forest of some strange incident. Colin listened to him, continuing to calmly finish his food and not showing much interest. However, deep down, the guy knew that this situation could just give him the opportunity he needed. Meanwhile, a monster with red eyes appeared in the depths of the forest. It was a black deer, who suddenly became alert, sensing the approach of someone unfamiliar. However, he didn't have to wait long. The next moment, arrows flew at him. One after another, they hit the beast's side. The ambush set up by the main character was successful. He emerged from the darkness with a bow in his hands and approached the fallen monster. Then he took out his sword and finished off the beast. And then the hero suddenly noticed a faint glow inside his body. The hero cut open the carcass and took out the monster's core, which could be used to gain power. Although the core was of the lowest rank, Colin believed that this was only the beginning. His magic book confirmed that such a core could be used to make a mana potion, so the boy decided to use the find. Shortly before, Cornell had informed him that the best hunting grounds were only accessible to high-ranking knights and nobles. Then Colin realized that there was no way to get there the usual way, and he began to look for a way to get around this limitation. His hunt was soon interrupted by Duck. He was outraged that Colin had dared to enter the restricted area on his own and began to scold him, but the main character paid almost no attention to his words. Instead, he calmly informed him that he would borrow his sword for a short time. Duck didn't even have time to do anything before Colin had already pulled his weapon out of its sheath. The young man had absolutely no idea what his friend wanted to do. Colin then walked up to the slain monster and plunged his sword into it. He then turned to his friend and declared that he was now considered the hunter who had killed the beast. The young man understood how ridiculous the situation looked, but it was almost impossible to argue with Colin's logic. Duck was still angry about being forced to work alongside a common servant. He couldn't understand why Cornell had given him this job in the first place. However, Colin calmly explained that he was acting on direct instructions from his assistant. As proof, he showed the dagger and added that they were tasked with investigating and obtaining meat for the Lord. Duck sighed heavily, realizing how unlucky he was with his partner. However, he decided to focus on the task at hand and simply ignore Colin's odd behavior. After a successful hunt, they laid out the fresh meat they had caught and finished their work with a short prayer. Duck then began setting traps around the perimeter, hoping to perform well and eventually get promoted to a regular servant. However, he was soon distracted by Colin, who cheerfully beckoned him towards the fire. Duck was horrified when he saw what exactly his comrade was doing. Coming closer, the guy saw that he was already frying the meat that they were supposed to deliver back. Duck immediately became furious and reminded Colin that this food was meant for the Lord, but he took a bite completely calmly and continued eating, as if nothing special had happened. Then the hero handed the guard another piece and offered him something to eat too. The young man recoiled and declared that taking food from the lieutenant's enemies was treason. Then Colin reminded him of the strict rule that new guards could only eat once every 3 days. Moreover, since his weapon had already been confiscated, punishment was inevitable anyway. Colin brought the meat closer to him and asked how he was going to defend the Lord on an empty stomach. The guy then calmly promised to keep his actions a secret. Finally, Duck couldn't take it anymore, took the meat and started eating. Colin noticed that he had been holding back his real strength all this time. After this, he asked again why a man with such abilities mindlessly obeyed a useless leader. Duck, for his part, didn't understand why Colin even considered strength to be important. The nobles received divine power through their faith, and he himself hoped one day, through diligence, to become one of God's agents. Moreover, he rose to the position of a middle-class servant only so that his sister, who was far away from him, could be proud of him. The young man became angry and demanded that Colin stop mocking the beliefs to which he had dedicated his entire life. He believed that they were already lucky to be servants, so all they had to do was obey and not ask unnecessary questions. Colin, however, privately considered such ideas about divine power to be naive. He knew how this world was actually structured. Therefore, he understood that the so-called divine power was just the ability to use a little magic. Duck was furious at these words and suggested that Colin learn at least one spell himself, since he thought magic was so simple. Then the protagonist calmly looked at him and asked what he would do if Colin himself offered to teach him magic. At that moment, Duck froze. He couldn't believe what he heard. He even began to doubt whether an ordinary servant like Colin was capable of using magic at all. However, at that moment, Colin suddenly heard birds cawing right above their heads. He soon realized that it was an attack. Not far away from them, a young guard screamed in pain as a ghost wolf tore at his body. At the same time, a detachment of soldiers tried to hold the line, fighting off a flock of the same creatures. Their commander tried to maintain the defense, but the animals gradually broke through the formation. They moved so fast that the soldiers barely had time to react. Even the commander found himself in danger when one of the wolves grabbed his shield and began to break it with its jaws. At the last moment, when the monster was about to kill him, he managed to deal it a crushing blow and stopped the attack. The commander turned around in surprise when he heard one of his subordinates shout out the name of their comrade Glenn. However, suddenly a third ghost wolf attacked the commander from behind. The man realized that he had not had time to defend himself. But at the very last moment, some mysterious warrior appeared nearby and killed all the wolves with his arrows. No one could understand what exactly had happened, and at that moment, a figure unknown to the guards emerged from the bushes. As it turned out, it was Duck and the main character. They said that they came to help them. Colin noted to himself that the meat, bones, and skins of the azure flame beasts were highly valued at the market. They said that if you killed at least one of them, you could live absolutely comfortably for some time. But the most powerful thing these beasts had was their cores, so the protagonist had no intention of letting any of them go. Meanwhile, several more animals were approaching the clearing, coming to the aid of their fellow tribesmen. However, the protagonist prepared himself for the fact that they were about to attack him and jumped high into the air. The squad leader looked at him in shock, not believing that this guy had broken right into a pack of wolves. The hero himself just calmly aimed his weapon at them, thinking that these weaklings couldn't even hunt without a pack. He was sure that these wolves were no match for him, and so with one deft movement, he killed 3 of them at once. After that, he landed calmly on the ground, as if nothing unusual had happened. But he quickly realized that the battle was not over yet, as he heard a strange sound right behind him. One of the remaining wolves jumped at him, but Colin managed to duck in time. He thought about how the wolves were still attacking even after seeing him kill their kin, apparently not realizing the difference in strength at all. Then the main character decided to counterattack the beast and delivered a powerful kick straight into its huge chest. From such a blow, the monster flew far back and crashed its body into the trunk of one of the trees, which surprised everyone else. Without thinking twice, the protagonist took aim and fired another arrow straight into his chest, finishing off the furious beast. He thought to himself that this was just an ordinary monster, so there was absolutely no point in feeling sorry for him. And then he suddenly noticed that another small pack of these same wolves was approaching them from the forest. Seeing the enemy, they immediately rushed at him, but the hero reacted in time and again fired 3 arrows at them at once. Meanwhile, the squad leader was in shock. This guy defeated the azure flame beasts, which even they couldn't handle. Colin still knew the battle wasn't over, as he heard the strange sound behind him again. He managed to jump back in time before a powerful energy attack impacted the place where he had just been standing. When the hero turned around, he saw another wolf behind him, who was simply burning with rage. Taking a closer look at it, Colin realized that it was an unusual animal. Apparently, it was the leader of the pack. After this, the wolf fired 3 more energy projectiles at him, but the protagonist managed to deftly dodge each of them. Immediately after this, he jumped into the air and shot 3 times at the vital parts of the animal. Once it was disarmed, he began to descend, but prepared himself for the final crushing blow. He kicked him in the head with all his might, finally finishing off the furious animal. After this, he finally sank to the ground, realizing that the battle was over. And then suddenly the main character felt that someone's arrow had flown literally a few centimeters from his face. Colin immediately turned around and saw that someone had shot the beast, which had still been alive all this time, right in the eye. This man turned out to be none other than Duck. He looked seriously at the protagonist and warned that he should not let his guard down. Seeing such a cool move, Colin gave his friend a thumbs up and praised him for a very good shot. However, he only looked away and said that it was just a trifle. Meanwhile, the commander of this detachment approached them and noted that the guys were incredibly strong, after which he asked whom they served. Duck replied that they were not direct subordinates, but served Darius. He was a reservist in the guard, and Colin was a low-ranking servant. He also stated that they had come here to provide support on the orders of Mr. Cornell, which greatly surprised everyone else. The guards couldn't understand what Cornell was thinking when he sent this old woman's subordinates here. However, apparently, Duck did not quite understand which old woman was being talked about. Meanwhile, the protagonist studied the magical spheres he found in the wolves' bodies, noting that they were of medium rank. Now, if he simply prepared the potion according to the instructions in the grimoire, he would be able to further increase his stats. However, his thoughts were distracted by the voice of a man who addressed him by name. One of the guards approached Colin and asked who gave this brat permission to touch his monster. However, the commander told the guard to leave the monster to these guys, since the Marquise's task was now a priority. But the hero did not like this treatment at all. He said that calling his saviors brats was too rude. When the guard, whose name was Marvin, heard these words, rage appeared on his face. He was about to rush straight at him, shouting at him not to get cocky, but his comrades stopped him. At this moment, the main character decided that he had clearly heard this name somewhere before. His memories shifted to his past life, when he was standing with Darius and looking at someone's portrait. The man said it featured Glenn, Marvin, and then Sarah, and Cornell was also in the picture. Colin noted that these three were the knights Darius trusted the most, who died during the investigation in their past lives. This ultimately led to the Marquise losing his power, and now the protagonist had a chance to change this fate. At that moment, Duck stepped forward and asked Marvin to stop, saying that his friend was a newbie who didn't know the rules well. Meanwhile, a girl named Sarah approached him and said that the old witch's dog should not have interfered in these matters. However, Duck had absolutely no idea what exactly these people were talking about. Then the commander said that it seemed that Colin was the very newcomer who had told the lady that he would become the next lord. Now the man had no choice but to admit that Colin was indeed strong. However, he still said that if he did not cast aside these unworthy thoughts, he would definitely regret it. At this point, the protagonist remained silent, deciding not to aggravate the already tense situation. The boss said that he was grateful to Colin for saving them, but they had a mission, so they should have already left for it. And then suddenly the boys heard someone snap a branch nearby. They immediately tensed up, thinking that enemies were approaching them again. At that moment, birds flew over the forest again, clearly frightened by some loud sound. As it turned out, a whole crowd of wolves was approaching our heroes, wanting to avenge their relatives. The boys froze in horror, watching as a whole crowd of monsters approached them. At their head was one huge wolf, which was tens of times larger than all the others. Sarah quickly realized that it was none other than the Azure King, the true leader of these wolves. Within moments, the wolves surrounded all the guards from all sides and began to growl angrily at them. It was the Azure King who behaved most furiously. Suddenly he reared up and thrust his huge claws out in front of him, intending to tear these little people apart. All the guards froze in horror as they watched the attack of such a huge monster approaching them. Without thinking twice, the Azure King struck with his huge clawed paws right at the place where the people were. The commander of the guards narrowed his eyes, expecting that one attack from this monster would kill them all. However, when he opened his eyes, he saw that they were still alive. Moreover, someone had saved them from this onslaught. As it turned out, it was none other than Colin who blocked the Azure King's attack with his sword. After that, he turned to the commander and noted with a smile that he was very sorry, but he saved them again. The Azure King was shocked that some ordinary person was able to block his attack. The protagonist decided not to give him time to think through his plan further and immediately rushed to attack him. To do this, he used a sword technique called Mountain Destroyer, after which he delivered a powerful blow directly to the monster's neck. This blow caused the huge monster to droop for a moment and groan in intense pain. However, the protagonist understood that this monster was still very strong. It took him only a few seconds to gather himself and raise his huge paw again for another attack. The protagonist managed to put his two swords in front of him at the last moment to protect himself from such a huge explosion. However, this protection was not enough for him, and he was thrown back somewhere. Colin knew that with his current body, defeating this monster with just swordsmanship would be difficult. Just one such attack had already managed to destroy both of his blades, so now he was left effectively unarmed. The commander then explained to Colin that the Azure King was a formidable foe who had already killed many elites in the Empire. At this moment, the monster suddenly noticed that these people were talking too much, so he ordered his wolves to attack them, and they immediately rushed to attack. Marvin didn't understand what to do now. They couldn't even cope with ordinary animals, and then the king appeared. However, Colin said that he did not have to worry about these mongrels, as they were just the king's puppets. He explained that the Azure Flame Beasts were simply following his orders and had no will of their own. In other words, if they kill the king, the rest of the wolves will simply scatter in different directions. But Dak said that they would never defeat an enemy that even the Empire's elite could not cope with, and besides, their swords were already pretty worn out. However, the protagonist stated that if they didn't try to attack him, they wouldn't know how strong he really was. Duck looked at his comrade with disbelief and said that he was a real madman. But the commander said that in any case, they would have to fight if they wanted to survive. Sarah replied that even so, breaking through the pack and reaching the king would be difficult, but Colin said that they did not need to do that. He stated that they would soon have a very good opportunity and they would have to take advantage of it. Meanwhile, the Wolf King seemed to be preparing for another attack. He roared very loudly throughout the forest, and his subordinate wolves immediately rushed forward at their opponents. The guards began to shield themselves from such an intrusive presence, and the commander said that they now needed to prepare for a confrontation. However, Colin spoke up again and asked everyone to calm down once again. Looking forward resolutely, he asked to let these wolves come a little closer. Marvin was outraged. He didn't understand since when this brat had been giving them orders. However, their commander Glenn said that now was not the time for showdowns and suggested that they simply follow Colin's instructions for now. After this, the main character turned to Duck with a grin and said that he should go with him. He stated that if he really wanted to be a big brother that his sister could be proud of, then he should have done it. These words had an immediate effect on Duck, and he immediately remembered his sister Erica. At this moment, Glenn shouted to everyone else that the enemies were already very close to them. As it turned out, the monsters were indeed literally a few dozen meters away from them. However, the protagonist stated that it was not close enough yet. Despite everyone's concerns, he asked the boys to let the wolves get a little closer. At this moment, the wolves were already preparing to jump on their opponents and tear them apart with their paws. Then the hero said that now was the perfect moment for their attack. He turned to Captain Glenn and asked him to blind those monsters with his sacred shield. The man immediately obeyed the protagonist's order and activated a sword technique called the Sacred Shield. Immediately after this, Colin turned to Marvin and told him to push back the enemies with sky-cleaving strike. But the man had no other choice, so he also obeyed and used the sky-cutting strike. The attack was very successful, and he hit all the blinded enemies. After this, the hero turned to Sarah and said that she needed to clear the way with her ghost blade. Her attack rolled over every wolf, not missing a single one of them. At this moment, Glenn was surprised at how well this guy knew the skills of using completely different types of weapons. Once all the previous steps of their plan had been successfully completed, Colin turned to Duck and said that they should move out. At that moment, Sarah turned to Duck, calling him a puppy, and told him not to hesitate. However, the young man himself still did not understand what all these people were talking about. And yet he obeyed and ran straight after the main character, carefully avoiding the remaining living wolves. On the way, he asked Colin what he was planning, and he said that the Azure King was used to inspiring fear. Therefore, if the enemy attacked him without hesitation, it would already throw him off balance, and the same thing happened with people. However, Duck still didn't understand what exactly his comrade was getting at, but Colin said that it didn't matter. Even if they get closer, they won't be able to defeat him with their swords, but there are other ways to attack besides fencing. And then the young man began to understand what exactly his friend was hinting at. At that moment, the protagonist began to gather a blinding energy ball in his palms. A mysterious voice informed him that the magical lines had been opened and the internal magical power had been activated. Immediately after this, the protagonist concentrated his energy into a magic seal and used the ice lotus. The next second, shards of ice burst out of the magical seal and headed straight towards the Azure King. Duck couldn't believe his eyes. He still didn't believe that his comrade actually used magic. The Azure King was seriously injured after this attack, but he was still alive. Colin looked at him with a determined look and asked if he still wanted to continue the fight. The wolf was breathing heavily from how intense this fight was, but he still couldn't give up. Then the guys jumped back a little to regroup their forces and catch their breath a little. But the wolf didn't let them do this. He jumped straight at Dak, who was also about to strike him. But the young man was still faster. He jumped onto the beast's face and plunged his sword right into the bridge of its nose. The protagonist praised his friend for his excellent work, after which he prepared to use another spell, which was supposed to be the final one. He summoned the magic seal again, and suddenly the same huge knight in armor appeared behind him. He pointed his giant sword straight at the wolf, who was still trying to throw Dak off. At some point, the beast realized that all this time Dak had simply been distracting him, and the real attack was waiting for him ahead. Before he could do anything, he saw a column of powerful energy flying straight towards him. The blow was so powerful that it easily broke through the wolf's huge body and cut off its head. The next moment, the Azure King fell, and all the other wolves stood there in confusion. At this moment, Duck was already standing on the ground and watched the defeated enemy with surprise. He still couldn't believe that they were able to defeat such a huge monster with the protagonist's plan. He looked at Colin again, not quite believing that he actually had magic. At that moment, the remaining guards emerged from the bushes and asked the boys if they were okay. The man added that because they had defeated the king, the azure flame beasts had scattered. Marvin didn't understand how the two of them managed to deal with such a huge monster, but Colin said he just had a good plan. At that moment, Sarah carefully examined the fragments that were left behind by the monster and began to guess something. Meanwhile, Marvin laughed and said that looking at this guy reminded him of their boss in his youth. Duck didn't understand which boss they were talking about, and then the man explained that he meant Darius. Sarah explained that they were formerly members of the Knightly Order of the Lionheart, which was commanded by Darius. After the order was disbanded, the remaining members became elite knights, and she was surprised that the dog didn't know this. Duck was very unhappy that she continued to call him Doggy and asked which old hag she was talking about. He stated that he was not a dog, he had a name, and his name was Duck. Moreover, he called Sarah an old woman, and it seemed to be a fatal mistake on his part. Marvin walked up to Duck and whispered to him that he didn't know why, but Sarah was calling the lady an old cow. Duck was horrified when he learned that someone dared to speak about the lady in such a way. Then Sarah approached him and with fury in her eyes asked in what way she looked like the old woman. She stated that no matter how you looked at her, she was a young and vigorous girl in the prime of life. After this, a squabble ensued between them, which caused laughter among everyone else. However, the main character still maintained a serious expression on his face. He remembered how they had fun in his past life, and these thoughts even made him feel a little sad. However, at that moment, they were distracted from their thoughts by the clatter of hooves of a horse approaching them. Sitting on top of her was none other than Fred. He looked at the guards with displeasure and asked them what was happening here. The guards immediately stopped when they saw young Master Fried, and Sarah asked him what he was doing there. When Duck realized who exactly was in front of him, he immediately hesitated. It was obvious from his face that he was very afraid of the young master. All the guards knelt before Fried and asked for forgiveness, to which he said that he heard the noise and hurried here from the camp. And then he suddenly noticed the corpses of wolves that were lying nearby and asked what exactly had happened here. Glenn replied that they were heading deep into the dark, deep forest to investigate when they were attacked by a pack of azure flame beasts. If these two guys who came to their aid hadn't helped them, they would have been in the stomachs of these monsters long ago. At that moment, Fried noticed that the same guy Colin was digging through the corpse of one of the monsters. The protagonist took a knife and cut open the monster's carcass in the hope of finding something useful for himself there. Glenn said that these guys really showed a lot of promise and they would like to return to camp to report on their achievements. At that moment, Fried realized that this guy really dared to aim for the Lord's place. At the same time, the young man understood that his father should not have known about what happened here. In that case, he himself could find himself at a disadvantage in the struggle for the inheritance. And then suddenly a brilliant idea came into the young man's head. He noticed the protagonist's comrade Duck, who looked very scared. Meanwhile, Fried was thinking about a plan, and this brought a satisfied and cunning smile to his face. He approached Duck and said that he had been wondering where he had disappeared to, but it turned out that he had been hanging around with a guy like Colin. However, Fried reminded him that lower-class servants were forbidden from the hunting grounds, and this was a gross violation of the rules. And yet, Duck, knowing all this, still snuck in here with Colin just to grab a piece of the spoils. Fried told him that if his precious sister Erica found out about this, he would have to learn the lesson again, as punishment. However, at that moment, Colin said that it was still better than being a spoiled puppy who couldn't do anything without his mother. Then he turned around and with a sly grin told Fried that he and that loser had met again. When Sarah heard him call him a loser, she laughed. The young man himself was very outraged that this pathetic slave treated him like that. Then the protagonist calmly told him that these people bowed to him not because he was worth anything. He stated that they did this only because his mother was a countess. Colin added with a grin that he must have been very comfortable pretending to be important, but only because of his parents. Fried told him that he could kill someone like Colin in an instant, and the hero didn't even argue with that. However, he said that if he really wanted to kill him, he would have to ask his mother's permission first. He asked him to go to his mother and ask if she could allow him to kill the servant who had offended him. These words finally drove the young master into a rage. He also turned to his subordinates and ordered them to detain this scoundrel. Right at that moment, chains with weights flew towards the main character, which were supposed to grab him. Colin noticed that they were approaching him, but he was in no hurry to run away. At that moment, iron chains began to wrap around his arms, preventing him from moving. Literally the next moment, warriors in skeleton masks wrapped iron chains around his entire body, not allowing him to even move. One of them approached the main character from behind and put a sharp sword to his neck. At that moment, the squad of guards realized with horror that these were none other than the so-called Blades of the Empire. They were a group of professional assassins and spies in the employ of the Williams family, and their cruelty and skill were incredible. Sarah couldn't quite believe that Countess Katrina had entrusted the protection of her own son to people like them. Glenn then turned to the young gentleman and said that they had been sent here by Cornell to help with the investigation. At that moment, the young man turned to the commander and asked him if he was also going against him. The man hastened to justify himself by saying that in reality, everything was completely different. However, noticing his confusion, the protagonist turned to him, not letting him finish. He said that he didn't need to worry about him. They needed to go and report the results of the investigation to the head of the family. Sarah immediately turned to the commander, noting that this guy was trying to give them the opportunity to leave safely. They could not side with either the boy or the young master. It was better for them to simply retreat quietly. And although Glenn understood that this was the safest option for them, he was still tormented by vague doubts. And yet, he still understood that they would not be able to go against the young master, so he really retreated. Left alone with his enemy, Fried turned to him and said that now that he was so helpless, his life was in his hands. In response, the protagonist only laughed and said that if he wanted to kill him, then he should have stopped delaying it. In response, Fried also smiled, clearly feeling the power in his hands. Then he reached for his sword and said that he had just had a great idea. He then turned to Duck, who was trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible with his whole appearance. Fried looked at him with a predatory smile and said that every action had consequences. After this, he threw him his weapon and declared that he would give him a chance to atone for his guilt if he would pick up this sword. After this, the young master ordered him to immediately go and kill this slave. At that moment, the young man froze, not knowing how to react to such an order. Fried said that if Duck did this, he would turn a blind eye to everything that happened today and would not do anything to him. Meanwhile, the protagonist's thoughts returned to his past life, a month after the demon invasion began. Their entire settlement was captured by demons, and they were tied up and thrown straight to the ground. Colin was very unhappy with this turn of events, but he could do nothing against such huge monsters. At that moment, he saw one of them thrust his weapon into the ground, right in front of his nose. The Demon King, who sat on the throne right in front of him, asked the protagonist with a smile what he would choose. After this, he turned to the others and said that he could let these people go, but on one condition. He pointed to the captured Dak and said that he would do this if the protagonist killed his comrade. Duck himself was completely confused and very afraid of everything that was happening. The demon continued to insist and asked Colin with a smile what he would ultimately choose. At that moment, the protagonist took the sword that was thrown to him and carefully rose to his feet. After that, he turned to his friend, who was being held by one of the monsters, and walked slowly towards him. He approached him meter by meter, dragging behind him a heavy demonic weapon. And then Duck turned to him, saying that the day when he was told that the old man had died fell exactly on Erica's birthday. Soon after, his mother also died of illness. He and his sister ended up as slaves, but they were lucky enough to be picked up by Lord Darius. On the lady's orders, Erica was sent to the Williams family estate, but the demons had not yet reached there, so he was sure that she was safe. So before he died, Duck asked his friend to take care of Eric for him. She had always been a picky eater, so he asked Colin not to spoil her too much. He also wanted him to tell her something, to tell her that her older brother had become a full-fledged knight. After this, the main character came even closer to his friend and apologized to him. Now they were in a completely opposite situation. Such a difficult choice fell not to him, but to Dak himself. Colin stood in front of him, chained up, not even having the chance to resist. Meanwhile, Duck gripped the sword tightly in his hands, but his whole body continued to tremble violently. However, Fried was already bored with all this friendly drama, and so he wearily turned to Duck. He asked the young man with displeasure why he was taking so long. He stated that if it weren't for Colin, they would all be dead already, so he couldn't bring himself to kill his savior. This turn of events greatly interested the impudent young man. He wondered what Erica would think if she found out that her beloved brother had abandoned her for some stranger. However, Duck hastened to justify himself by saying that he would never do anything like that. Fried then added that he had recently heard about the incident from the Williams family's butler. He claimed she had been cutting back on her own food intake to save up for Daku's sword and was said to have collapsed from exhaustion last week. When the young man heard such details about his sister, he immediately froze in horror. Fried continued to press him, saying that if he still intended to leave her after this, then he no longer had a reason to care about her. At that moment, Duck realized that he could stand it no longer and fell to his knees, turning to the young master. He began to desperately beg him to save his little sister. However, Fried only turned around, clearly displeased that Duck had failed to carry out his order. Before leaving for good, he turned to Duck and said that he would do it if he killed Colin. When the protagonist heard this, he could not contain his mockery. He was so amused by this whole situation that he laughed throughout the entire forest. At the same time, the young gentleman himself did not understand at all what he had said that was so funny. The main character answered him that even a homeless dog on the side of the road could bark, unlike him. However, a coward who was actually worse than a dog could never kill him. He said that he and Duck would be better off just fighting to the death. At least it would be more interesting than watching him sit and whine. Meanwhile, the young master still didn't understand what this guy was thinking about. The protagonist had already noticed that one of Fried's subordinates was approaching him and pointing a weapon even closer at him. Then Fried realized that this guy was just pretending to be brave, but in reality, he was very afraid of the blades of the Empire. So he asked his subordinates to let him go, saying that he wanted to see how he would actually fight. As soon as the soldiers heard the order, they immediately threw off the chains that were preventing the protagonist from moving. After this, he took his weapon and went out one-on-one against his comrade. Without thinking twice, Colin pointed his sword at him, which greatly frightened Duck himself. He didn't believe that his friend was actually going to fight him one-on-one, because he knew he wouldn't win. However, Fried continued talking about his precious little sister, and said that he didn't need to make her cry. At that moment, Duck was distracted, and Colin, taking advantage of this moment, immediately jumped on him with a weapon. He delivered a powerful kick that sent the young man flying backwards. After that, he pointed his weapon at him, but Dak managed to dodge in time. But the blow was still so strong that the young man was thrown back, even despite his block. Duck was horrified at how fast his comrade was moving. However, Colin didn't stop there. He immediately jumped forward and came down on him again with another blow. At the last moment, Duck managed to put his sword in front of him and block the blow. However, Colin moved incredibly fast, and the young man was unable to react as quickly as lightning. Then suddenly the protagonist quietly turned to him, apologizing to Duck and saying that he didn't want to die either. At this point, Duck became truly scared because he thought that his comrade was actually going to kill him. He realized that this was a life or death battle, and so he immediately launched a counterattack. The main character even had to jump back, but he still maintained a confident expression on his face. After that, he held up 3 fingers in front of him and told Duck that he would only need 3 movements. With a satisfied grin, Colin said he would finish this fight in just 3 moves. When Duck heard this, anger appeared on his face, as his comrade was clearly mocking him. Then he also held up 3 fingers in front of himself, declaring that he didn't even need 3 movements. He would finish this fight in 3 seconds. After that, he looked furiously at his opponent. At the same time, the cunning grin still remained on the protagonist's face. Meanwhile, Fried watched everything that was happening with a little disbelief, but he was interested in how it would all end. Finally, the boys jumped up from their seats and ran towards each other. Although Duck was very afraid, he had no intention of giving in to his opponent. They both jumped into the air and raised their hands to attack each other with their swords. At that moment, Colin suddenly stopped and whispered to Duck not to abandon his comrades. As their swords clashed, he looked at his friend with a very serious look. And then suddenly Duck remembered the words of a girl he knew, who also asked him not to abandon his comrades. This touched the young man very deeply, and so he stopped immediately. He did not continue the attack and instead sank back to the ground. Freed's warriors, who were watching everything that was happening from the side, did not understand what was happening between these two. At that moment, both young men flew past each other, but did not strike each other with a single blow. Instead, they used their most powerful skills to strike at those standing around them. From such a powerful blow, all of Freed's servants immediately began to cover themselves with their hands. The young gentleman's horse began to tremble with fear, and he himself had no idea what was happening. Because of the thick smoke caused by these attacks, he couldn't see what was happening between Duck and Colin. But as soon as the smoke cleared a little, he looked up and saw that the main character was flying straight at him with a weapon. Apparently, Colin was furious and determined to put an end to this madness. However, Freed clearly had no intention of letting him get away with it. He activated his magic and stopped his attack with his palm, which was enveloped in magical glow. However, Colin continued to advance with a grin, adding that Freed seemed to be capable of something too. He continued to look at him defiantly, which irritated the young gentleman even more. He looked at him with indescribable fury on his face and ordered him to stop underestimating him. After that, he intensified his attack even more, and the main character was thrown back by a powerful magical explosion. However, he still managed to stay on his feet, but at that very moment he was surrounded by the blades of the Empire. At first, Colin didn't understand how they could have gotten here so quickly. And then suddenly, to everyone's surprise, Fried shouted at them to move aside. The warriors looked at him in surprise as they were already preparing to take the protagonist back into their chains. But Freed still continued to shout for them to move away, as he was going to finish off this scoundrel himself. At this moment, the protagonist's face became serious, and he prepared for another fight. Fried screamed at the top of his lungs and began to gather all his strength into his palms. When Duck looked up, he saw that a huge magic circle had appeared right above them, with lightning swirling around it. He realized with horror that it was a magical power. The mysterious voice also told the protagonist that it was nothing other than magic. And although Colin understood that the situation was becoming very problematic, he did not lose his composure for a second. Based on Freed's stats, he was an average fighter, meaning that, according to the grimoire, his strength doubled every time he leveled up. At some point, the main character even thought that perhaps he would not be able to resist such a force. But he was nevertheless convinced that if he didn't try it, he would never know whether he could do it or not. Freed himself was furious and told Colin that he would now show him the difference in their strength. After that, he sent a magic projectile towards him, but the protagonist had already prepared a magic circle in his palm. As their forces collided, a powerful explosion of magic and ice energy echoed where the hero stood. With the help of this spell, the main character was able to protect his body by encasing himself in ice. The explosion was so powerful that it sent huge clouds of dust into the air, obscuring the vision of everyone standing around. Fried had to cover his face to keep the rocks from hitting him, and he was left wondering if it was magic. However, when the dust cleared a little, he saw that many ice projectiles were flying towards him. At the last moment, he managed to neutralize them with his magic, and they never touched his body. And yet the young gentleman still did not understand where ice could have come from in such a place. When the smoke finally cleared, the protagonist came out to face him and asked if that was all he could do. Having suffered virtually no injuries, Colin smirked and called Freed a loser. The warriors who arrived with the young master were shocked that Colin was still alive. Duck also couldn't hide his surprise that his friend survived such an attack. At first, Freed thought he was just taking advantage, but now it became clear to him that there was definitely some kind of trick behind it. Then he shouted that it was absolutely impossible for a simple slave to use magic. He began to gather strength for another attack, but Colin told him that he would never be able to defeat him. And then suddenly, a mysterious voice informed him that he would not be able to use magic because his mana was depleted. Hearing this, the protagonist fell to his knees in horror, realizing that his strength was completely leaving him. He watched as the magical projectiles approached him, but he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Freed's magical attack completely surrounded him, but he was unable to resist it. He looked at his opponent in horror, realizing that such an attack could be fatal for him. Meanwhile, Freed himself continued to scream and informed Colin that it was now his time to die. After this, he concentrated all his power into one point, causing an incredibly powerful magical explosion there. The main character screamed from such a strong attack, he was in incredible pain. At that moment he became furious, his eyes lit up, and he actually began to fear that he was about to die. He was in despair that he had failed to grasp such a great chance to start his life anew. The voice again informed him that using magic when he lacked mana could cause it to go out of control. But the main character still decided to take a risk, declaring that he did not intend to die here. His entire body was enveloped in dark magical energy, and he no longer looked like himself, now he looked like a demon. Moreover, all of his indicators now had the status of unknown, and Colin himself did not understand what this could mean. Moreover, he was in pain from what was happening to his body, and he wanted to get rid of it as soon as possible. However, he understood that such an effect was unlikely to last long, and therefore he needed to take advantage of the moment. He swung his sword, parrying Freed's attack and realizing he needed to act as quickly as possible. The young master froze in horror when he realized that this man could still use magic. However, he himself had never heard such magic. He did not understand what was happening to Colin. At that moment, the main character jumped into the air and unleashed an attack from above on his opponent. As he landed, he thrust his sword straight into the ground, and blocks of ice began to emerge from there. In a few moments, they became so large that they simply tore the ground apart, leaving a huge furrow there. Freed was forced to use his last strength to shield himself from such a powerful ice attack. And then he suddenly noticed that Colin was no longer in front of him. He took advantage of the moment and jumped to the other side. Taking advantage of his brief confusion, the protagonist immediately began to attack him. He pointed his weapon towards the young gentleman, but he managed to dodge it in time. Freed was terrified at how fast his opponent was. He tried to hold back its onslaught, but even his magical power could not help him. Then finally, the main character was able to strike him, and at that moment, someone's blood gushed in all directions. At the last moment, Freed managed to jump off his horse and cursed, realizing that he was on the verge of death. Meanwhile, the main character was literally shaking and breathing heavily from how hard it was for him to contain this energy. The young gentleman looked at him in horror, still not understanding what was wrong with him. And yet he knew that, judging by his appearance, he was already at his limit. So Freed began to accumulate his most powerful energy within himself and opened a magic circle under his feet. Numerous lightning bolts began to swirl around him, and although it was difficult for him to contain them, he continued to accumulate strength. He directed all his attacks towards Colin, but he held his sword in front of him and defended himself from the lightning. He moved so fast that the lightning simply couldn't reach him. In literally an instant, Colin was right in front of his opponent and told him that this battle was over. He was about to deliver a powerful blow with his sword, but Freed managed to jump back in time. He literally hissed with rage as Colin struggled to land the finishing blow. And then suddenly the boys saw that a golden magic circle had appeared right between them. He was so strong that the main character was simply thrown back. As it turned out, he was summoned to protect Freed. When the boys turned around to see who did it, they saw a man there who ordered them to stop in a stern voice. It turned out to be Darius, who stated that this was a hunting ground, not an arena in which they could fight. He stated that if they were so eager to fight, they should do it after returning home. Apparently, Freed was very unhappy that his father interfered at such an important moment. The protagonist remained calm, while his strength began to gradually fade from his body. He dropped to his knees and said he was very glad to see it was finally over. The man was very surprised by what he saw, and clearly did not understand what was happening to his second son. Suddenly, Colin just fell face down on the ground and said he really wanted to take a nap. He woke up only a few days later, and when he opened his eyes, he saw that he was in some expensive palace. Colin was completely confused and had no idea where he was or who had brought him there. And then suddenly the moment when some strange dark force took hold of his body surfaced in his memory. These terrible memories made the main character immediately jump out of bed and begin to frantically look around. When he looked at his hand and saw no trace of magic there, he sighed a little in relief. And then suddenly, the man who was sitting next to his bed asked him if he had finally woken up. Only now did the main character realize that he was not alone in the room. When he turned around, he screamed in horror when he saw the terrifying face of his friend Duck. The one with huge black bags under his eyes and a frightening smile wished his friend good morning. He soon explained to him what had happened. As it turned out, after that fight, Colin had suddenly passed out. Captain Glenn carried him all the way here, and Sarah threatened the healers that she would kill them if the protagonist died. At this point, Colin himself began to think that this was too much. Then he finally got up from his bed. As his strength had returned a little, he felt that his body had been restored. He told his friend that they needed to go and thank Sarah and the others, and that he needed to get something to eat at the same time. But before they left the room, the main character suddenly remembered something and smiled broadly. He turned to Duck and also thanked him for everything that had happened. The young man himself was very surprised by what he heard, because it seemed to him that Colin had already forgotten what it meant to say thank you. Soon after, they headed into the city. The other servants made way for them, as they were clearly frightened by the aura of this young man. The main character himself had absolutely no idea what was causing such a reaction from those around him. The maids continued to whisper that rumors were circulating throughout the city about this man and Lord Freed. Hearing this, Colin approached the two maids and asked them what they were talking about. However, the girls immediately screamed in fear and immediately ran in the other direction from him. Duck didn't understand what caused such a reaction. They ran away as if they had seen a ghost. When the main character heard about the ghost, he suddenly thought about something. He assumed it was because Duck's face was pale, like a ghost's, but he doubted it was his fault. However, their conversation was interrupted by loud stomping that was approaching straight towards them. As it turned out, it was none other than the lieutenant with whom the main character had recently had a skirmish. The one-eyed man looked at Colin with fury and asked if this was really their wise and great future lord. But when both young men ordered him to be quiet and not to interfere in their conversation, he immediately began to shake and apologize to them. The man himself did not even understand why he reacted that way, and it took him time to think about it. However, he then pulled himself together again and declared that he had come here today to repay the debt he owed that day. The protagonist just looked at him with an inscrutable expression, not understanding what the man was talking about. The lieutenant stated that he had been completely careless last time, and that was why Colin had caught him off guard. However, now this time, he was sure that everything would be completely different. Now the lieutenant was intent on taking from the protagonist what was due to him. However, Colin himself still looked at him completely emotionlessly. Then the lieutenant loudly addressed the guards and ordered them to come here. Colin continued to look at him in absolute silence. The lieutenant once again turned to his guards, asking why they weren't coming to him, thinking that they had forgotten about such a simple signal. And then suddenly the guards hesitated, saying that this guy had recently had a duel with a young master, in which he showed himself to be a monster. They stated that starting a fight with such a person was clearly not the best decision. The lieutenant was furious at how cowardly and useless his guards were. However, he understood that if he retreated now, he would finally lose his position. And then the man thought that if he couldn't even cope with that brat, then he would finally lose everyone's respect. At the same time, he was confident that he would be able to overcome this puny boy. The lieutenant immediately rushed towards him, grabbed him by the clothes, and asked how he dared to betray Lord Freed. The man declared that if the Lord had failed to punish this ungrateful scoundrel, he would do it instead of him. Immediately after this, the man clenched his fist in order to attack Dak. However, he stopped his fist with his hand without any effort. The lieutenant tried his best to continue his onslaught, but he couldn't even move Dak's palm. Then he looked at him with a stern gaze and declared that he had no right to punish him. After this, he pushed the man away from him with all his strength, while he was still confused. The one-eyed man still couldn't believe that this freak dared to go against him publicly. And then suddenly, another person entered their conversation and ordered them to stop immediately. As it turned out, it was Glenn, who asked them with displeasure what all the noise had been like since early morning. He arrived at the square with his subordinates, angrily declaring that because of them, he couldn't even eat properly. The lieutenant thought that these brats were very unlucky that an elite knight had noticed them. After this, he immediately knelt before Glenn and demanded permission to report to him what was happening here. He pointed his finger at Duck and Colin, saying that he was really just teaching those stupid slaves some manners. When the main character saw a familiar man, he also raised his hand and greeted him. The lieutenant immediately ran up to him and called him an impudent fool, asking if he really didn't understand who was standing in front of him. At that moment, Stephen walked up to him, hit him in the face with all his might, and told Glenn that he had bet money on him waking up that day. At that moment, the lieutenant was horrified. He did not understand why this slave was treated so kindly. The other knights also approached him and began to communicate with him in a friendly manner. At some point, the one-eyed man even thought that he was just dreaming all of this. He began frantically to say that lower-class servants were forbidden from associating so closely with knights. It was a violation of the rules. Then Sarah told him threateningly that they didn't care about the rules that this old hag had come up with. She told the lieutenant that he needed to keep his mouth shut if he didn't want to lose his other eye too. These words made the man fall silent, while the protagonist and his comrades walked away from him. Finally, he turned to the lieutenant and apologized to him for defeating him again. Once everything was finished, all 5 of them went to the tavern to celebrate the protagonist's awakening. Colin said he was going to come and thank the knights for saving him, but they ended up helping him out again. Sarah said with a smile that it was actually even better that way. She never liked that deputy anyway. Then Duck asked her if she also had some kind of score to settle with the deputy. The girl also became furious and said that he shouldn't ask about it. It makes their drink taste bad. At this point, Glenn turned his attention to himself and said that they actually wanted to talk about something with the 2 of them. He stated that now only the 3 of them remained from the elite knights, so they would like to ask them to join them. Duck was very surprised that they actually wanted to invite them to the squads of elite knights. The man said that if they became elite knights, they would be treated the same as high-class servants. However, the protagonist apologized and replied that they were not interested in becoming elite knights. He added with a smile that he had much bigger ambitions than that. When he said this, the 3 knights looked at him in bewilderment. Marvin asked him to give up the idea of becoming the ruler of the Rhine. He shouldn't be arrogant just because he was lucky in that duel. He said he won only with mysterious fencing, but everyone laughed and said it was more like magic. She stated that if her instincts were correct, he had used magic to defeat the Azure King. However, Marvin was perplexed. He did not understand where a former slave could have learned something like this. Glenn was intrigued by this theory, and so he asked the protagonist to explain what happened that day. At this point, Colin visibly tensed up as he realized the boys had noticed. However, he had prepared an excuse for himself in advance, so he was not afraid that he would have to answer for it. After that, he looked at Duck, who even began to sweat a little from stress. Sarah continued to press the protagonist, asking him to tell the whole truth. At one point, Colin even began to think that perhaps they had actually found out something about him. Then the girl mysteriously pointed her finger at him and declared that he was, in fact, a former nobleman. At that moment, all the other guys at the table suddenly fell silent. Sarah jumped across the table towards him, grabbed his hand and said that she understood it right away. Colin was the illegitimate child of a nobleman who was persecuted and forced into slavery due to a conspiracy. His true purpose in arriving at the Marquis' estate was to gain power and take back everything that had been taken from him. Duck was confused. He didn't understand where they even got this theory about the former noblemen they were pursuing. When the main character heard this version, he immediately burst out laughing. He said he couldn't believe they actually figured him out, and Sarah immediately said she knew it all along. Colin began to pretend to cry and said that he was originally a nobleman from the city of Isle, but due to a conspiracy, he was exiled from his family. However, he decided not to let this break him, and one day he would make the nobles who framed him pay for what they did. Duck thought that maybe Sarah and Marvin believed him, but Captain Glenn would definitely not fall for such a lie. But, to his surprise, the man also believed this version and told Colin that as long as he did not create problems for the Marquis, he would keep it a secret. However, he advised the hero not to use magic in front of Lady Katrina or the young master. He also said that the Marquis wanted to see him after he woke up. Soon after, the protagonist and his companion set off back to the city to meet the Marquis. Glenn watched him go, while his 2 subordinates talked among themselves. Even though he pretended to believe Colin's story, he still really doubted that it was actually true. When they arrived at the palace, Duck told the hero that he couldn't believe that such a wild lie actually worked. He asked Colin why he had decided to use the story of the former nobleman from the city of Isle. The main character said that it was all just Isle, a place where everything good and bad is mixed. Moreover, this city was far from the Rhine territory, so it was difficult for them to conduct an investigation. The hero added that this whole story with noble origins was quite convenient to confuse people. However, Duck still didn't understand why he needed to confuse anyone, and then he decided to ask the main character if he knew anything about the 3-legged crow. However, he had asked Colin beforehand not to tell him that this was another trick that was meant to confuse him. At that moment, Colin's memories flashed back to the moment when the demons ordered him to kill Duck. Then he apologized to his friend and was ready to deal him the final blow. But instead of doing so, he jumped on his friend's back and cut off the head of the monster that was holding him. As it turned out, he was apologizing for deciding to send such an awkward message to his sister. Therefore, he stated that a little later, he would be able to convey to her everything he wanted to say. With these words, the protagonist jumped straight towards the monster sitting on the throne, and he erected a magical barrier in front of him. At that moment, the protagonist saw that his weapon was enveloped in some strange purple energy. When he put the blade to the monster's throat, it suddenly laughed. The main character's entire sword was enveloped in this strange energy, which prevented him from striking. Moreover, Colin himself felt that it was penetrating through his nose and mouth, preventing him from breathing. The monster looked at him with a smile and asked if he really thought that someone like him could kill him. While he was completely occupied with the main character, Duck took advantage of the moment and jumped up to him from below. He said it would be a problem if the monster suddenly noticed that he had been here all this time too. The demon was completely unprepared for such an attack, and therefore was unable to defend himself from Dak's blade. So the boys hit him in the chest and face at the same time, putting an end to his bullying of them. The moment the monster died, this strange energy around the protagonist suddenly began to dissipate. Then they were finally able to deal him more powerful blows and cut this monster into pieces. When they finished, Duck was very unhappy that the hero called his words clumsy. While they were arguing, they didn't even notice that a whole crowd of demons was approaching them to avenge the death of their ruler. However, as it turned out, they saw all of this, but simply decided not to be distracted from the argument by such a trifle. Without stopping arguing with each other, they killed the monster one after another, without even giving them a chance to touch them. The more furious their argument became, the faster they cut through the crowds of huge monsters. The rest of the villagers watched in horror as the two boys fought so carelessly. When there were no more monsters left, they were still arguing about whether the message was clumsy or not. And then suddenly Duck stretched out his hand in front of him and showed him a three-finger gesture. He stated that it was the sign of the three-legged crow, a gesture that a man named Rowan taught him when they were in the slave association. Duck explained that his comrade must definitely help when he saw this sign. The main character became interested in this sign and even tried to repeat it on his hand. He then noted that it seemed like Duck was planning to get captured again, and his comrade clearly didn't like these words. Now, in his next life, Colin said that he learned this gesture from one person, but he was already dead. Yet he added that the man was his stupid, stubborn best friend. The man wondered if he was talking about someone he knew from his time as a slave, perhaps someone from the slave association. Soon after, Colin and Duck arrived at the office where the Marquise was and knocked on the door. Once inside, they immediately bowed, and Colin asked the head of the family why he had called them. Seeing his son in perfect health, Darius smiled and asked him how he felt. Colin said he made a full recovery, and it was all thanks to his father's care. Darius also turned his attention to Dak and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. In response, the young man also greeted the head of the family. Then the man finally decided to say why he had called them both here. He stated that he needed to talk to them about the incident at the hunting grounds. At that moment, Duck began to think that entering the hunting grounds without permission had been a bad idea after all. Then Darius stood up from his seat and walked along the walls, looking at the paintings, and said that he had known Glenn and his people for a long time. He said they had faced mortal danger together countless times. Eventually, they finally got to the position they were in now, and Darius couldn't even imagine that he would lose them. So he looked at the boys with a smile and thanked them for saving these 3 knights. Duck bowed to him and said that if they had only noticed the anomaly a little earlier, they could have saved more people. However, the Marquise told them that the 2 of them had done absolutely nothing wrong. He admitted that it was all his responsibility because he failed to foresee the monster's attack. After that, he asked the guys if they had received an offer from Glenn to join the elite knight squad. However, the protagonist apologized to his father, saying that he was forced to refuse such an offer. Darius then looked at Dak and asked him what he thought about the proposal. He asked him if he wanted to become one of his elite knights, a question that stumped the young man. He did not believe that someone like him could become a member of the guard and suggested that the title should be given to someone more capable. However, the protagonist told him that the head of the family asked what exactly he wanted. Finally mustering his strength, Duck declared that what he really wanted was to become an elite knight. After this, Darius turned to Colin and said that if he had any other requests, he should voice them. After thinking for a bit, the main character looked at his comrade and decided to tell it like it was. Then he began his conversation about Duck's younger sister, whose name was Erica. He asked his father to transfer her to the Hall family. Currently, she was serving the Williams family. When Duck heard this request, genuine surprise appeared on his face. Then the hero explained that Erica and Duck had been together all this time until they ended up with the Hall family. Since the girl was in very poor health, Colin was sure that Duck would also be very happy to be with her. Then Darius asked his son if this was really his wish. Colin explained that he and Duck were comrades in arms who fought back to back and were also close friends, so he simply couldn't ignore his friend when he was in trouble. The protagonist turned to his father and asked him to return Daku's beloved sister. When Darius heard about his comrade in arms and close friend, he couldn't help but think about his interactions with the knights. He stated that since the Williams family was involved, it would take a little time, and then told the boys they could go. Duck was still confused, not understanding why Colin used his wish to help him. Soon after, he left the office, leaving father and son alone. Darius then turned to Colin and asked him if he remembered the day he challenged Slate to a fight in the arena. The man said that even then he was sure that Colin was not an ordinary slave. When he took the magical attack and defeated his opponent without a scratch, even he himself was surprised. However, what impressed Darius most was what he showed a few days ago in the fight with Freed. He spoke of the power that enveloped his body and made him look like a demon. He stated that if the persecuted nobleman from the city of Isle wanted to return to his former life, there were many ways to do so. At this moment, the protagonist realized that his words had already been conveyed to his father. He saw no point in hiding his true identity any longer, so he activated his magic. He told his father that he was not really such a great man. According to Colin, he was just someone who could use a little magic, but in reality, he was an ordinary person. From his perspective, as a Grandmaster-level Great Mage, he should have been nothing more than an insignificant figure. However, Darius stated that he found it hard to believe that an ordinary person could use such magic, so now he became even more interested in finding out who this young man really was. Then Colin removed his magic and, turning to Darius, called him the greatest ruler who loved his people and was loved by them. After that, he reached for his weapon, saying that Darius respected true ability, not blood. It was a real honor for the main character himself to be recognized as a person like him. He stated that his ideal was to embody Darius's ideal and eradicate blood supremacy from this world. The young man stated that one day he really wanted to become as great as the Marquis himself. Moreover, he said that he eventually wanted to even surpass him in strength. Colin hadn't forgotten that Darius had saved his life twice, so he first decided to prove his strength and worth at the qualifying test. And how to use the sword that he was, the Marquis had to decide for himself after he saw the result of the test. When the man heard this, he laughed loudly and said that it was all very curious. He waved his hand and said that in that case, he wanted to see what Colin was capable of, after which he said that he could go. Before leaving, the protagonist bowed once again and asked for forgiveness from the Marquis. But before he could leave the room, the man addressed him again. He looked at him with a serious expression and asked Colin what he thought of Rowan. However, the main character did not understand which person he was talking about. Deciding not to go into details, Darius said it didn't matter, then said that Colin was free to go. Then the protagonist went outside and stopped there for a while to think about their last conversation. At that moment, Darius was watching him from the window and asked someone what he thought about what he had just seen. As it turned out, Cornell had been hiding in the room all this time, having concealed his identity with the help of magic. He stated that if Colin was really just an ordinary man, then he could be called an incredible genius. Judging by his reaction just now, he didn't know Rowan, which meant that at the very least, he probably wasn't a noble from Ale City. He may have had some ulterior motives, and so they definitely needed to remain vigilant. The butler then said that after all, there had been a precedent, so they needed to keep an eye on him. At that moment, Darius looked down at the photograph of his wife and remembered that very incident. At that moment, the butler took something out of his pocket and said that they had just received a message from the spirit cat. He handed the letter to Darius, who was surprised that so much time had passed. He was curious what information they would get this time. Soon after this, evening came, and the protagonist had already gone to his room. There, various medicines, materials, and gold coins, which the Marquis left for him as trophies, awaited him. Colin realized that with so many useful things, his abilities should have increased significantly. However, what now concerned him most was the question of who that man named Rowan was. In his past life, he had only heard this name from Dak, but knew nothing else about him. Moreover, the way Darius asked about him just recently was strange, as if it was natural for him to know who he was. However, the hero decided that it didn't matter now, and decided to use his trophies. Next time, he would try to ask Dak in more detail about this man, but now the main thing was to gain strength before the selection. So he added the required amount of supplies to the flask, and drank it in one gulp. For some time, the main character felt absolutely calm, as if nothing had happened. But then he turned furiously to the grimoire, and commanded it to open. At that moment, a glowing book appeared right above him, and numerous sheets of paper with magical symbols began to fall from it. Then the hero once again brought one flask to his mouth and drank the rest of the potion. Soon after, he emptied several more flasks of various greens. Now that everything was ready, he had to begin a very important task. He concentrated the energy in his hands and commanded the grimoire to absorb it. When the process began, the protagonist felt very strange, and the veins on his face appeared from tension. Then a mysterious voice informed him that the absorption was complete and his magic power had increased by 1 point. Colin thought that he mixed the Azure Flame Beast core with the Jade Emperor grass to increase his strength. That's what the grimoire said, but even the best quality medicine only increased it by 3 points. Moreover, some products, depending on the type, did not increase strength even by 1 point. However, if his magic ran out, it could go out of control, like last time. Therefore, until he figured out how to increase magic resistance, he had no choice but to increase his magic power. Colin noted that if he drank the potion one at a time, the sun would rise before he finished, or rather, his stomach would fail before he finished. Then he wondered if there was a way to make this whole process easier. And suddenly, the system informed him that a powerful monster core had been discovered, and Colin could create a magical instrument. To do this, he needed to use the Azure King's core as material. Colin remarked that it sounded interesting, and then directed the material to the right point. When everything was ready, the space around him began to glow with golden light. The protagonist closed his eyes to concentrate on this sensation. At that moment, the silhouette of a minotaur appeared behind him, holding a huge hammer in his hands. The protagonist noted to himself that, following the grimoire's instructions, he was pouring magic into the monster's core. Then he had to imagine the shape of the magical instrument in his mind, and Colin thought about which one would be best to make. However, he decided not to think about this issue for long and decided everything quickly. After that, he concentrated all his power on the magic ball in his hand. At that moment, the Minotaur behind him growled furiously. He struck a powerful blow to the place where Colin was sitting, thereby creating this instrument. At that moment, his room was emitting such a bright light that it could be seen far beyond the house, but gradually the energy began to subside. Then a mysterious voice informed the hero that the creation of the magical instrument was complete. Colin eventually received an azure bracelet that blessed the Wolf King and increased his strength gain by 1. Moreover, an additional effect was the so-called wild instinct. Then the main character picked up another flask of potion and drank it, deciding to try something. Then the voice told him that his magic power had increased by 2 points, which was exactly what Colin had expected. Even if a low-quality medicine could only increase it by 1 point, if he had the bracelet, he could increase it by 2. Colin noted that the magical tools were convenient, but he was interested in this effect called wild sense. And then suddenly the main character heard some strange, incomprehensible mooing behind the door. Deciding to take advantage of his new effect, he decided to look through the door to see what it was. As it turned out, they were 2 maids who were complaining to each other about how tired they were that day. At that moment, the main character suddenly screamed, completely not understanding what was happening. He began to suspect that he now had the ability to see through walls, but he quickly realized that he was seeing people's energy. Then he turned his attention to the other side and decided to see what was happening there. There were 3 guards there, talking about something of their own, pointing somewhere to the side. Then he looked in the other direction, where Marquis Darius and his wife Karina were. Seeing a purple glow near their bodies, he thought it was most likely magic. And then the young man suddenly heard someone's voice saying that he was very hungry. He carefully looked behind him, still not understanding who the voice belonged to. Behind him he saw lower-class servants, but he quickly realized that the voice clearly did not belong to them. It also couldn't belong to Freed and his Imperial Blades. And then he suddenly noticed a very bright glow of mana coming from one of the windows. Then the main character focused his attention on this window and tried to understand who was there. Looking closely, he saw that a girl was sitting there reading a book, and 2 maids were standing next to her. But as soon as the main character looked at her, she also turned her head in his direction. Her gaze was so intense that Colin even felt uneasy. He felt her gaze bore into him and examine him to the depths of his soul. He winced under the intense pressure and felt as if something was pushing him back. He was furious that this stranger had noticed him, but at the same time he knew that it was to be expected. As it turned out, the girl was Lady Angelica, and she told her worried maids that she was simply bothered by a fly. As it turned out, it was Angelica Hall, Darius's second daughter. At that moment, Colin realized that in any case, that voice he had heard earlier did not belong to her. He knew it would be a bit difficult for him, but he decided to try to widen his search radius a little. The protagonist used his skill again, after which he heard a voice that continued to say that he was very hungry. Quite quickly, Colin found where it was coming from. It was somewhere in the dark, deep forest. When he looked more closely, he realized that somewhere in the depths of the forest, there was a very powerful magical force. Colin began to suspect that it was none other than some kind of demon. Meanwhile, things were going on as usual in the palace, and Dak was initiated into a squad of elite knights. Many were happy about this event, but not Katrina and her son. While his friends were overjoyed for Duck, they remained absolutely silent and did not say a word of support to him. Marquis Darius personally attended the ceremony to knight the young man. Katrina merely watched attentively as the middle-class servant rose through the ranks. She thought about how much had happened since the Lord had picked him up a few years ago. Dak was used as an example to the other servants and punished in the most brutal ways. He was also her son Freed's favorite toy. It was on Dak that he took out his irritation and used it as he wanted. Since the young man was a slave, he could not say anything to his master. However, now he was in a completely different position. Now the Lord himself was initiating him into an elite squad of knights. Finally, Darius solemnly declared that he officially recognized him as an elite knight. These words brought a smile to Dak's face, and he immediately looked towards where his comrades were standing. The main character, along with a squad of knights, immediately began to encourage the young man. Katrina just continued to watch what was happening with disdain, thinking that the lower classes should serve the nobility. After this, she turned and called her son to follow her, thinking that the nobility should properly guide these lower creatures. She was sure that this was fate. It was an absolute rule that would never change. Shortly after this, Katrina went to have tea, but the maid was unable to cope with this errand. Then the senior maids punished her. They threw her on the floor and started calling her useless trash. Katrina herself was clearly not in the mood to listen to this squabble, so she gestured for the girls to step aside. Since the maid had done very badly, she was in for a serious punishment. The other girls picked her up and carried her to the edge of the room, despite her screams and pleas for forgiveness. Soon after, the senior maid took the branding iron and dipped it into the hot coals. And then she picked up the red-hot seal and held it right up to the unfortunate servant's face. The next moment, a piercing scream from the girl was heard, which made Katrina even bite her lip. At that moment, she suddenly heard the voice of a girl. It was Erica, who had finally arrived at the palace and was reunited with her brother. Not long before, Darius told his wife that he wanted to bring a maid named Erica from the Williams family into their home. The woman reacted skeptically to this proposal, as she did not understand why it was necessary to do this. Darius even explained that it was a promise he made to Colin, and therefore, he had to keep it. Thus, Erica and Duck were finally reunited at the Hall house. But Katrina was obviously not happy about everything that was happening. She couldn't believe that her husband would go so far for some monkey. Fried also did not understand why his mother accepted his demand and demanded an explanation from her. He stated that if things were left as they were, it would obviously tarnish their dignity. However, Katrina did not want to hear about dignity from him when he lost to the monkey and disgraced himself. The young man was a little embarrassed by these words and said that if he had fought seriously, everything would have been different. But these words only made his mother even more angry. She slammed the table with all her might using her magic and declared that it was high time for her son to wake up. Continuing to scream, she said that only monkeys fight monkeys. The magical flash was so strong that everyone around immediately turned their attention to it. The maids standing nearby were simply torn apart by how piercing this energy was. When their blood gushed towards Fried, he immediately screamed and hurried to cover himself with his hands. Katrina pointed him in the direction of the dead maids, telling him that he shouldn't lose to a monkey in the qualifying test. Otherwise, exactly what happened to these girls will happen to him. Katrina stated that if he lost, then they would be on the same level as those worthless slaves. Fried then suggested that perhaps in that case, they should just make the monkeys fight each other. Then Katrina turned her attention to that same fallen nobleman from the city of Isle. She stated that for the sake of Lord Darius and the Hall family as a whole, she would definitely stop him. Soon after, the family selection test began, with a huge number of people arriving. Everyone was interested to see the fight of the boy who had disgraced Viscount Slate in front of everyone. As expected, the main characters also arrived for the test along with the rest of the guys. Not long before, Cornell had asked him if he really wanted to enter the dark deep forest. He explained that, unfortunately, entry was only permitted to the head of the family, or the official heir. Even though the man really wanted to help him, there was nothing he could do at the moment. Now the protagonist thought about his words as he stood in line for the duel. At some point, he decided to activate his skill to see what was going on around him. He realized that that terrifying magical power clearly did not belong to a human, and he needed to come up with a way to test it. At that moment, the Lord came onto the stage, and everyone present immediately turned their attention to him. The spectators were very happy that the test was finally beginning. Then Darius addressed everyone present, and said that the long-awaited day of the selection test had arrived. He stated that if the subject had the power, he could get whatever he wanted. That was the absolute rule of his family. The man stated that the winner of this challenge would receive an additional reward from him. He said he would grant the right to bear the name Hall to the one who wins this battle. However, Katrina suddenly interrupted him, saying that she was holding a ring that had been passed down in the Williams family for generations. She stated that finding this ring, hidden in the testing area, would be the condition for victory. However, apparently, the Marquise was not very happy with this decision. Not long before, they had discussed Darius's decision to bring Erica to the palace. Katrina said that if he really wanted it, then of course she would agree to it too. However, she wanted to demand something from her husband in return. She agreed to bring Erica in exchange for him, allowing her to approve the content of the test. So now everything was as she wanted. Katrina told the subjects that there was only one ring. In other words, only one person can win. There can be no exceptions. The woman said that she would teleport the ring and all participants to random locations within the testing area. Moreover, she also prepared various equipment and objects on the territory, and the subjects could use them as they wished. At that moment, a bright, glowing magical seal appeared under the feet of all the test subjects. Once everything was ready, Darius prepared to announce the start of the test. He solemnly announced that the selection test was declared open. At that moment, the main character noticed that Katrina was looking at him with a suspiciously cunning look. Soon after, all the subjects were transported to an area with a huge active volcano. Colin jumped out of one of the many portals and headed straight for the ground. He landed carefully and immediately began to think about his further path in this test. He immediately remembered his past life, when this test caused him a lot of problems. Meanwhile, the Marquise family was watching everything that was happening. They saw the movement of each test subject through the portals. Duck, along with the rest of the guards, also watched everything that was happening. The boys watched Colin's actions closely, hoping that everything would be okay with him. The Marquis and his family also watched closely everything that was happening. Soon one of the participants already received a weapon, which he obtained from one of the dead. Another young man also took the bow from the skeleton, which, although scratched, was still suitable for testing. Meanwhile, the main character was walking through the forest and humming a song to himself. At that moment, both young men with guns had already taken aim at him and were preparing to kill him. But Colin effortlessly dodged the arrow that was supposed to hit him in the head. She barely grazed his cheek, and he was even surprised that these guys were surprisingly capable. Immediately after this, a guy with a sword rushed towards him, but the main character dodged this blow as well. The man attacked him very fiercely from all sides, but he could not reach Colin's speed. At that moment, he felt himself hit by a tree and realized he didn't have time to deal with these guys. Then he immediately jumped back from there, leaving the subject in complete shock. The young man began to look around, trying to understand where his opponent, who had just been in front of him, had gone. Meanwhile, the main character was already hiding behind another tree and carefully watching the second enemy. He noticed a slight movement near the tree and immediately fired there, but only hit the tree trunk. After that, he screamed and told Colin with a grin that it was time to give up. Soon the boys surrounded him and declared that his end had come, but promised to kill him quickly so that he would not suffer. In response, the main character only laughed and said that they would still see who met their end here. After this, he pointed his finger at his opponents and asked them to look closely at their hands. When the young people looked at their palms, they saw with horror that they were covered with some kind of swollen veins. They immediately started screaming and asking what it was. They had the feeling that something was moving under their skin. Then the main character explained to them what happens when you steal other people's things, hinting at their stolen weapons. He also explained that it was a centipede that ate a person's heart. This insect penetrated the human body and literally tore his heart apart from the inside. After one victim was dealt with, it looked for the next. Then one of the men shouted at Colin that if he died anyway, he would take him to the grave with him. But in response, the hero only laughed and said that the time had not yet come for that. He stated that in fact he too had been infected by these poisonous creatures, after which he showed them his wounded palm. However, he added that he managed to find an antidote to this thing. He showed the young men the flask and said that if they let him go, he would give them the antidote, but if not, he would break it right there. At that moment, the guys looked at each other and decided that they would do as he said, and when they were cured, they would immediately kill him. Then they turned to Colin with sly smiles and promised to let him go if he gave them the medicine right now. But in response, the main character theatrically grabbed his head and said that he was not at all against giving it up. But the problem was that there was only one dose of antidote. At that moment, the boys looked at each other, realizing that only one of them would survive. They started shouting at each other, asking Colin to give the medicine to him, and started to set each other up. A serious fight broke out between them. They began telling each other's plans, trying to justify themselves in front of Colin. Then they rushed to the main character and began tearfully begging him to give the medicine to one of them. In response, the main character just smiled and said that he understood everything perfectly. After that, he threw the flask to the young man with the crossbow and said that he chose him. The young man was very happy and began to thank the hero for saving him. But before he could finish speaking, his recent comrade cut off his head and declared that the medicine belonged to him. After the man with the crossbow died, he immediately snatched the vial of antidote from him. Without thinking twice, he opened it and immediately drank the blue liquid that was inside. After that, he pointed his sword at the main character and said with a grin that now it was his turn to die. He stated that all the talk about them letting him go was complete nonsense, and as soon as he received the reward, he would bring his head to the lady. In response, Colin smirked and said that he suspected it. Apparently these guys found a common goal and united. Then he pointed to the empty flask and asked the boy if he seriously thought that this was a real antidote. He explained that he had simply collected water from nearby, and that his contamination was also a lie. He had simply gotten dirt on his hands. When the young man realized that he had been so brazenly deceived, a look of rage mixed with fear appeared on his face. He also rushed at the main character with his weapon, shouting that he would kill him right now. But before he could do so, the veins on his face bulged and blood gushed from his nose and mouth. After this, the young man fell face down on the ground, and Colin realized that the poison had apparently already spread throughout his body. Before he died, he explained to him that the area was contaminated with the miasma of poisonous insects, so that even the water here was poisonous. But after that, the main character asked him to be kinder to other people in the next life. The dying young man continued to whisper that Colin would die, that the Williams family would not let him leave here alive. However, the main character only took the ring off his finger and laughed quietly. He said that this gift would be very useful to him. Before he left, he told the boy to consider this poison as his return gift to him. Soon after, the protagonist headed forward through the forest, where two huge snakes were already waiting for him. On the way, he found a cloak with which he could hide more effectively among the trees. After some time, he came across the entrance to the dungeon, near which lay numerous corpses. Above the entrance, there also hung someone's skull with huge fangs and horns, and its eyes glowed with a bright light. Then the main character finally exhaled, realizing that he had finally reached the right place. Without thinking twice, he walked through the skeletons and headed straight to the entrance to the dungeon. The further he walked, the more skeletons he came across lying on the floor. And then suddenly one of them's eyes lit up, as if he had awakened. Immediately after this, the other skeletons also came to life and looked towards the uninvited guest. The protagonist noted to himself that this place had not changed at all since his past life. However, he was distracted from this thought by someone's scream, which came from one of the rooms. Someone was asking another person to stop. The protagonist immediately listened, trying to understand what was happening there. As it turned out, several warriors surrounded one girl, telling her that she had nowhere else to run, and now all she had to do was surrender. However, the girl was not going to give up so easily. She was determined to fight back against these people. Realizing that she had no choice, she was the first to attack the person closest to her. She swung her blades furiously and declared that she would fight until the very end. But in response, the young man with the spear only chuckled, not finding her threat threatening enough. At that moment, another man jumped towards her and kicked her in the face with all his might, throwing her away from his partner. The girl immediately fell and found herself in front of a man who was holding a heavy hammer in his hands and was preparing to strike her. He hit her on the head with all his might, and the blow threw her far forward. Then another man came up to her and dismissively put his foot on her back. He kicked her hard in the side and then demanded that she tell him where the man was. He then pointed to the girl's dead comrades and declared that if she didn't tell, she would end up just like them. But in response, the stranger only screamed that she didn't know where this man was, and even if she knew, she wouldn't tell them. Hearing this answer, the man only grinned. He then leaned towards her a little and grabbed her wrist with all his strength, deciding to try a slightly different method. He twisted the girl's arm, causing her to scream in pain, while the other men watched the incident with smiles. Watching all this from behind the rocks, the protagonist thought with disdain that this was the trash of the Williams family. And then suddenly the girl turned her gaze towards him and noticed Colin. At some point their eyes met, and then Colin realized that he didn't know what to do. He mentally apologized to the stranger, deciding that it was none of his business and that he would prefer to avoid any unnecessary problems in the test. However, the girl understood that this was her only chance to save herself, so she immediately began shouting for Colin to save her. At that moment, the other men noticed him and immediately asked the stranger in the cloak who he was. The protagonist turned to them and said with a smile that he was not really their enemy. The gangsters began to think that he was also from the Williams family, but they told him to get lost since it was none of his business. At that moment, the girl began to cry, as she had finally lost all hope of being saved. But then the main character pulled his hood tighter and said that he knew about it perfectly well, and then turned around and left. But before he could do so, the man with the hammer suddenly stopped him. He noticed that the guy was wearing a ring on his hand and noted that there was clearly something wrong with him. After that, he took him by the shoulder and tried to turn him to face him, wanting to look at him carefully. When Colin turned to face them, all the other bandits froze in surprise. They saw that there was clearly something wrong with their partner, who was standing right next to the stranger. The thing is, the main character pulled out a gun and stabbed him in the stomach, saying that he didn't want to interfere, but they left him no choice. After that, he took off his hood and looked furiously at the remaining bandits. He shouted that they shouldn't hold a grudge against him, and then rushed to attack the others. The men realized that this was the same brat they had already seen, after which they decided to kill him as a crowd. But the main character did not waste time and immediately launched his blade at one of them. It hit the unmasked man straight in the throat, causing everyone else to go into shock and be unable to move for a while. Taking advantage of this, the main character attacked one of them with his knee in the face. After that, he had to deal with one more man who was standing to the side. He immediately reached for his sword, angrily calling the protagonist a little freak. But before he could draw his weapon, he felt a blade pressed against his throat. Before he could say anything, the girl standing behind him cut his throat. When all the opponents were dead, she looked angrily towards her savior. And although she should have been grateful that he had ultimately saved her, she was still filled with hatred. Then she fell straight to her knees with the weapon in her hands. The protagonist continued to stand in place and did not even move an inch, while her weapon attacked someone behind him. As it turned out, there was another bandit behind, who had been hiding all this time and wanted to deal Colin the decisive blow. But at the last moment, the girl managed to strike him with a sword right in the chest, after which the opponents were finally dead. At this moment, the main character turned his attention to her and said that she fought quite well. The girl could not contain her emotions and began to cry, saying that she thought they would kill her here. However, Colin didn't really want to listen to all this hysteria right now. When the situation finally calmed down, they, together with the stranger, were able to take care of the consequences of their fight a little. Despite the fact that these people held her captive, she still decided to give them a proper burial. She wrapped each of the slain bandits in cloth and wished them rest in peace. The main character did not take part in this, but watched everything that was happening from the side. And then he suddenly asked the stranger why these people attacked her in the first place. She then explained that they were demanding that she tell them where some guy named Colin was. The girls said that they didn't know who Colin was, but they didn't believe them at all, and after the torture, everyone except her died. The protagonist tried to express his condolences to her, while realizing that he was the one being hunted. The girl then suggested that he was also from the Williams family and asked if he was allowed to raise his hand against his comrades. In response, Colin laughed and said that they were on bad terms from the start, so everything was fine. He then turned around and said that he was actually taking part in a screening test to leave his family, so he had to go. But before he could leave the room, the girl ran up to him and stopped him. With tears in her eyes, she said that she would very much like to help him in this matter. At that moment, an awkward silence fell between them. Then Colin asked her what someone who had almost been killed just a moment ago could do. In response, the girl said that at that moment she was simply confused because her comrades were finished off, but in fact, she was strong. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by an unknown man who approached them from behind and muttered something unintelligible. When the boys turned their heads in his direction, they realized that it was some strange man in a fencing costume. The girl suggested that it could be an ally of her new friend, but he said that he did not know him. At that moment she suspected something was wrong and looked closely at the man. When he raised his head, it became clear to everyone that he was not a man at all, but a living skeleton. The main character immediately covered the girl with his body and threw his dagger towards the skeleton, hitting him right in the eye. The blow threw the monster back a little, but he continued to stand on his feet. After that, he raised his head again as if the attack had not caused him any damage at all. Realizing that these monsters couldn't be defeated so easily, the protagonist grabbed the girl's hand and led her along. They ran past the monster, who at that moment was trying to pull the dagger out of his eye. The girl looked after him and asked why he wasn't dying, and Colin said that the corpse was controlled by the corpse bugs. He explained that they would move until they destroyed the main body inside them. However, the girl had absolutely no idea what kind of doll corpse beetles these were. Colin explained that they were parasitic monsters that parasitized people, sucked their blood, and turned them into walking corpses. He wanted to continue the conversation, but something made them stop. Colin added that, among other things, they exchanged information with each other and told each other the location of the prey. And judging by the fact that right now in front of them, there was a whole crowd of living skeletons, they realized that this was exactly what had happened. As soon as the reanimated corpses saw their prey, they immediately growled and rushed straight at them. At that moment, the girl noticed that another monster was approaching them from behind. But when she looked more closely, she realized that the monster was not alone there. It was another huge crowd. The protagonist's expression didn't change. He only said that these guys were quite persistent. He understood that they needed to come up with an excuse and escape through a hidden passage, since they would not be able to win in a direct fight. However, the girl said with a smile that in reality, they did not pose such a big problem. She stated that she was actually a little scared at first, but after his explanation, she was no longer afraid. Simply put, as long as they don't let these monsters infect them, they won't lose. Then the hero mentioned that the corpse bugs could copy the abilities of the host they were parasitizing. But the woman said that even if they used these abilities, with such wounded bodies, they would not be able to display true strength. Then she finally decided to introduce herself, saying that her name was Luna, after which she asked the hero what his name was. At first, Colin wanted to tell his real name, but decided to hide his identity and called himself Clark. Then Luna said that this time it was her turn to protect him. Concentrating, she began to prepare a spell that would hit all the monsters. She turned to the merciful god and asked him to grant her the strength to drive out evil. When the protagonist saw what she was doing, he froze in horror, realizing that it was the pressure of an advanced level swordsman. The girl continued casting the spell, saying that she was going to cut the shackles and direct the wandering souls to where they belong. After that, she looked at the revived corpses with a furious and determined gaze. They continued to run towards her, growling louder as they got closer to her. And then finally the girl released a cross attack, thereby destroying an entire crowd of monsters in an instant. As it turned out, Luna was using a sword technique called Clear Stream. Once everything was ready, she looked towards the hero, and he noted that she really had quite good abilities. But right at that moment, another living monster stood behind him, preparing to attack him from behind. However, the protagonist's reaction was incredibly fast, so he blocked this blow with ease. He then killed the monster with a single swing of his blade, noting that the trial grounds were not so lenient. And then suddenly, a mysterious voice in his head announced that a magical power had been discovered. When Colin looked ahead, he saw Luna rushing through the crowd of monsters, destroying several of them at once. With her awkward movements, she didn't leave these reanimated corpses a single chance. She noted to herself that if she continued to attack them at this pace, she would soon destroy them all. And then suddenly she noticed that one of the monsters, the one in the suit, was approaching her from the side. The girl then jumped high into the air, intending to attack him with her blades from above. She dealt him a powerful blow, but the monster managed to put up a magical barrier in front of itself and blocked her attack. Luna was amazed that a living corpse could copy such a powerful spell. It wasn't just a physical attack, it was a real use of magic. Luna didn't believe that this was even possible, so she immediately jumped away from the unusual opponent. As she was thinking about how a corpse could use magic, the rocks behind her began to move strangely. Before Luna could even process what was happening, legs were wrapped around her, preventing her from moving. After this, the reanimated corpse used another spell on her and pulled her towards him. Then he pushed the girl away and slammed her with all his strength into the stone wall. Luna was seriously injured and for some time could not even get up from the floor. And then she suddenly noticed something that struck her to the depths of her soul. The corpses approaching her were her former allies, Ryan, Kaylee, and Morley. At that moment, Luna was in absolute despair. She hung there, staring at one point and not knowing what to do. She was horrified that her comrades had turned into these monsters. However, the protagonist was not so sentimental, and therefore immediately attacked them before they could kill Luna. He stabbed one of the monsters right in the eye. At that moment, another monster was approaching him from behind, but the main character turned his attention to his comrade. When he looked at her, he realized that there was clearly something wrong with the girl. Her whole face was covered with strange spots and stripes, as if she was infected with something. As it turned out, at that moment she was being held by her former allies, who had already managed to bite and infect her. The protagonist was truly scared when he realized that the girl was now infected with a parasite. At that moment, a mysterious voice informed him that another magical power had been discovered. As soon as the protagonist looked back a little, he realized that the stone hand was moving straight towards him, preparing to attack him. But before she could do so, Colin jumped aside and destroyed it with a blow from his dagger. He refused to believe that even the magician's corpse was here. However, he understood that now he needed to save himself, and also somehow save Luna. So he immediately jumped towards the girl, and with one deft blow, cut down her revived allies who were holding her back. As soon as their grip weakened, the girl felt her strength leaving her. She fell right into the protagonist's arms, who couldn't stop thinking about how she was now infested with doll-like corpse bugs. However, then he suddenly heard that more living corpses were approaching them. Looking up, Colin realized that another huge crowd of monsters stood in front of him. He then threw his weapon at them, saying that they were terribly annoying creatures. His blade flew straight past the head of that very mage and crashed into the wall behind him. The reanimated corpse immediately turned its gaze to the blade that was sticking out of the wall a couple of centimeters from his face. Meanwhile, the main character took advantage of the moment and jumped to the other side. Then the revived monsters realized that this guy was just distracting their attention so they could get away. Before disappearing around the corner, the protagonist winked at them and said goodbye to them. Then they, along with Luna, hid behind the wall, not intending to waste their time fighting these monsters. Immediately after this, the protagonist jumped off the roof, still holding Luna in his arms. The cliff was very large and steep, but fortunately there was a small body of water waiting for them below, into which they could land safely. After this, the main character brought the girl to the surface, but she still had not come to her senses. Meanwhile, Colin himself lit a fire and decided to prepare a healing potion for Luna. He looked closely into the cauldron of boiling water, thinking about what he should do next. And then he suddenly heard strange sounds coming from the side where the girl was lying. As it turned out, Luna came to her senses and screamed in horror that the corpses were moving. At that moment, the main character immediately approached her and put a knife to her neck, ordering her to stop moving. The girl was very surprised that Mr. Clark was behaving so strangely. Meanwhile, the hero noted that the area between her eyebrows was slightly blackened and her lips were also a little purple. She was definitely infected with parasites. Her consciousness remained clear and there were no signs of mutation. Perhaps this was due to her body type. The protagonist explained to her that it was the lower level and those corpses did not follow them to this place. However, when Luna heard about the lower level, she became even more scared. Without further ado, the protagonist took a bowl of infusion from the fire and said that it was a decoction of medicinal herbs that he had collected nearby. Since she was already infected, it was impossible to completely cure her, but if she drank this, the mutation would slow down. However, Colin admitted that he did not know exactly how effective the concoction would be. Then Luna suggested that, in other words, she would sooner or later become like these corpses, and the hero confirmed her guess. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately drank the entire cup to the bottom in one gulp. The taste was so terrible that she almost vomited, but she managed to drink it all. After this, she jumped to her feet and said that she was ready to go, but the hero asked her where she was going. The girl said that the purpose of the test was to find the ring, so they had to follow that plan. She supposed that due to God's blessing, she was still herself despite the infection, so she had to act. Luna said that she would take care of the corpses, and the main character should have taken the chance and escaped from here. But, to her surprise, the protagonist said that he was going to stay here. At this moment, an awkward pause hung between the guys. Then the hero said that if you go down along this stream, you can get out, and initially he was going to escape from here. However, something else was more important now. He asked Luna if she could really bring herself to fight her own comrades. At that moment, the girl seriously thought about his question. However, she then looked away and awkwardly admitted that she wasn't really sure about that. The three of them had been her friends since childhood. They left their hometown, dreamed of achieving success, and supported each other. There were times when she was ready to give up, but her fate changed the day she met the head of the family. Luna thought that this test was also a chance given to her by God. So now she didn't understand at all why everything turned out exactly the way it did. Luna admitted that she wanted to free her comrades, but she didn't want to hurt them. She considered herself very pathetic. The protagonist then told her that the tears were proof that she still had a human heart. He added with a smile that, besides, it wasn't quite over yet. However, the girl did not understand what the young man was getting at. Colin explained that the main feature of these beetles was their symbiosis with their mother. In other words, if the mother beetle dies, the babies will die too. Of course, this also applied to what was parasitizing on the moon, but now only she had to decide whether she would fight alongside him or not. Hearing this question, Luna immediately replied that she would fight because she promised to protect the main character. And since she was infected anyway, she wasn't afraid of these creatures, but the main character said that he forgot to remind her of something. He stated that if she went with him, just in case she needed to drink another potion that was now on the fire. At that moment, the girl looked in surprise at the huge pot that was hanging over the fire. She realized with horror that the protagonist meant that she needed to drink absolutely everything. She stated that even that one cup was her limit, and then Colin said that in that case, they should forget about their previous conversations. Hearing this, Luna immediately ran after him, promised that she would drink everything, and asked him to wait for her. Sometime after this, she drank the decoction, and together they went further into the cave. The girl carefully examined the insects surrounding her, but Colin said that they should not linger. He said that the doll corpse beetle usually hid in the depths of such places. The way there was confusing. Luna asked him if he really intended to fight him head-on, since their opponent was most likely around 3rd rank. Then Colin asked her what 3rd rank meant, and the girl was surprised that he didn't know. She explained that the Empire's territory was home to a wide variety of monsters, so the higher-ups divided them into ranks based on their strength. The 1st rank monsters were usually not dangerous, and included the red-eyed black deer that was found in hunting grounds. However, the 2nd and 3rd rank monsters were those that couldn't be defeated without certain skills, and it seemed like the bugs were one of them. Still, she wondered why a 2nd rank monster could use magic. But Colin asked her not to complicate things, saying that the corpse beetle could simply parasitize the nobleman's body and copy his abilities. But Luna replied that a nobleman, chosen and protected by God, could never become a victim of a parasite. The hero asked her if she had really said that it was not magic, but an innate feature of the monster itself. But the girl said that this was also wrong, since magic was a special power granted by God, and when it was used, the circle of God appeared. She herself had never heard of a 2nd rank monster with birth abilities, only of the Azure Beast and their king. Both were considered monsters, and upon meeting them, one had to be prepared for death. They couldn't even be compared to beetles. The hero pretended to be very impressed by this information about the so-called invincible Azure Beasts. However, he did not reveal the whole truth that he had recently defeated all of them, and their king in particular. However, he doubted that this ranking system was even accurate, as there was a possibility that the corpse bugs were much higher ranked. He suggested that God could very well have made a mistake and said something incorrect. And then suddenly Luna screamed sharply, ordering the main character to stop. She asked him angrily if he was really trying to insult God now. But the protagonist was not at all frightened by such fury in her voice, so instead he smiled and continued on his way. He apologized to Luna, saying that he had simply misspoke, and then touched one of the stones. Then he turned to her and said with a smile that there were just some things he just couldn't understand. If the corpse beetles could use magic, did that mean they were divine messengers too? He asked Luna what if the power of magic was not a privilege available only to divine messengers. This question perplexed the girl, and she declared that magic was the proof of a messenger, bestowed by God upon the pious believer. However, the magic that the corpse beetle used definitely had the very circle she spoke of. These thoughts took her somewhere deep into her consciousness. However, the main character quickly brought her to her senses with a strong slap on the forehead. He said she could think about it after they defeated the mother doll corpse bug. After that, he walked forward again, and then Luna asked him where they had been going all this time. And then she suddenly looked around and noticed something strange. The hero said that he was going to use all these things to defeat the mother bug. When the girl looked at the barrels that stood next to her, she noticed that they smelled strongly of alcohol. When she looked at the rest of the boxes, she guessed that they contained coal. And then suddenly the girl realized that her ally was going to use fire. To her great surprise, she stated that it was absolutely impossible. It might have worked with an ordinary doll man, but she didn't think it would work on a 3rd rank monster. However, the main character was skeptical of her words and only looked at her with a smirk. He stated that it was too early to draw conclusions and then took one of the flasks. Then they went back to the right place and soon reached huge high doors. In front of them, the protagonist stopped and declared that the mother doll corpse beetle was right inside. Luna looked at the door with distrust and asked the hero how they were going to open it. In response, he took out his dagger and declared that, of course, they would break it. Before the girl could react, he delivered a powerful blow straight into the center of the goal. Seeing this, Luna laughed, saying that even an advanced level sword technique would not be able to penetrate such thickness. But when she closed her eyes, she realized in horror that Colin's blade had been able to destroy that enormous gate. She froze, completely unable to understand how he had done this with just one dagger. However, their path continued, and soon they entered the gate. There they found a rather gloomy room, on the floor of which lay strange purple eggs in a green liquid. The young people looked around and couldn't help but notice how terrifying this place looked. They passed by a pond, from which lay the body of a man who had also come here. He looked at it carefully and noted what a terrible state it was in. She felt uneasy at the thought that in some time she could find herself in his place. That's why she immediately hurried after the main character and was about to stop him. But something they saw in front of them suddenly made the girl fall silent. Directly in front of them was a majestic throne, upon which sat a terrifying figure, shrouded in strange energy. As it turned out, it was the same mother doll beetle that looked like a man in golden armor with a two-handed sword. Looking at the heroes who came to him, he immediately called them fresh meat. Luna was very surprised that the corpse was talking, but the hero replied that this beetle could speak with the voice of its host. Meanwhile, their opponent rose from his throne and declared that he had not eaten fresh meat for a long time. Looking at it more closely, Luna noted that this equipment did not at all resemble normal human equipment. Meanwhile, the mother beetle raised its sword and prepared to deal a powerful blow to its opponent. The main character immediately took the girl by the hand and threw her aside so that she would not get hit. It was so powerful that the shockwave swept through the entire throne room, almost hitting Luna. At that moment, the protagonist realized that this was the genius of the Hall family, one of the candidates for the position of the seventh head. In the past, he was the greatest swordsman in the Empire. His name was Golden Sword King Phoenix Hall. At this moment, Phoenix turned to the protagonist and said that it was time for him to change his body to a new one. The Proving Grounds was the place the Hall family used to choose their heir. It was an unexplored area, created by generations of family heads. Sparing no effort, they used the art of magic to collect monsters and treasures from all over the Empire. And even now, the corpses of those whose dreams were shattered roamed this land. The Golden Sword King standing before the heroes now was one of them, a great swordsman who left behind many legends. Despite his noble origins, he could not use magic, so there were many humiliating rumors about him. However, those who doubted his true power simply did not exist. Luna was very surprised when she realized that the person in front of them was indeed the Golden Sword King from the Hall family. She never imagined that an ordinary third-rank monster could control the candidate for the position of head of the Hall family. However, the main character did not find this such a strange phenomenon. The parasite only needed to use its young to drain his strength and then wait for an opportunity to parasitize. After all, nobles were also ordinary people, and so Colin decided to hurry and send this guy to God. At that moment, the girl looked at him with distrust, but said nothing. Then Phoenix laughed, assuming that these guys were afraid of him. And then he raised his sword and ordered them to bow down before him immediately. As soon as the protagonist realized that the enemy was advancing, he immediately warned Luna about it. Phoenix laughed and used his sword technique called Blood Shadow Blade against them. Several dozen swords flew towards the main characters, but they managed to dodge them. Taking advantage of the moment, the protagonist pulled out his blade and rushed straight at Phoenix. He also used his sword technique called Phantom Trace. Thus, he created illusions of his blade and directed them towards the enemy. However, he seemed to be covered by an invisible shield and immediately recognized the technique that created illusions to confuse the enemy. However, he was able to easily find a real attack and stop the dagger with his bare hands. He then clenched his fist tightly and destroyed his opponent's weapon in an instant. He threw away the remains of Colin's blade and declared that such things would not work on him. At that moment, Phoenix suddenly heard the girl in the middle of him suddenly start praying to God. Luna used her prayer before activating the sword technique called Blade of White Purity, but Phoenix immediately turned around and blocked her attack, saying that she was too slow. The girl was very surprised when she saw the speed of this monster's reaction. Immediately after that, Phoenix threw her into the opposite wall with one powerful kick of his leg. But the protagonist immediately took advantage of the moment and appeared right behind him, preparing to launch a new attack. In his hands was another dagger, which he had been hiding from his enemy all this time. He was about to strike him, but at that very moment Phoenix appeared right behind him. But Colin also reacted instantly and turned towards him, preparing to strike him again. Thus their weapons clashed, and neither of them allowed the other to strike. Phoenix stated that his reaction speed and durable body, which surpassed even adult beetles, made him a truly ideal host. After this, he pushed Colin away from himself, and the latter declared that he was a very impudent parasite. However, this situation only made him more excited. He jumped into the air, using a sword technique called Phantom Trace. However, Phoenix easily repelled his attack, saying that he had never learned anything. But then he suddenly felt some liquid running down his helmet, and he realized it was alcohol. It took him a few moments to realize what his opponent was really up to. Before Phoenix could even realize what was happening, Colin had used his plan to blast away his armor with coal. Phoenix immediately screamed, asking what kind of sword technique this was, even though he hadn't even used his blade. Colin then said that the Phantom Trail was a technique that intertwined truth and lies to inflict damage on the enemy. So it didn't matter whether he used the sword or not. In any case, with such a rotting body, Phoenix wouldn't last long. These words made the knight very angry, and he demanded that Colin explain what it was. The main character only responded with a wide smile. Memories of his past life in the resistance camp came flooding back to him. There, together with Dak, they sniffed strange flasks that smelled like some kind of cheap alcohol with some impurities. At that moment, a gray-haired man approached them and said that he had added something called sparkstone to the alcohol. The man explained that this stone could easily ignite from a small blow if it was lightly rubbed and thrown into strong alcohol. The result was a powerful explosion. They often relied on this method when they ran into damned nobles in the mines. Many of them died because they made a mistake with the dosage, but everyone worked desperately, fully aware of the danger. True, the nobles themselves did not flee in the end and abandoned them as soon as the demons appeared. But be that as it may, the man believed that it should have worked even against strong demons. So he set out to show them what true minor stubbornness was. At that moment, Duck wondered what they should even name this thing. Now the protagonist broke into a wide smile as a suitable name came to his mind. He threw the bottle towards Phoenix, declaring that he wanted to call this thing Divine Punishment. As soon as the jars made contact with his opponent, powerful explosions immediately echoed throughout the cave. Phoenix was horrified by how incredible this guy's strength was. He couldn't even move from the fire that surrounded him on all sides, while a second enemy approached him from behind. Luna threw another 10 of those jars at him, declaring that Phoenix was very unlucky today. Colin had told her shortly before that the mother corpse beetle had been hiding in the nest to protect the larvae. So he had to distract the beetle's attention, while Luna used the cones and destroyed the larvae. Apparently, their plan worked, as Phoenix screamed furiously, cursing those people. When the smoke cleared a little, they saw that the bodies of unborn larvae were lying all over the ground. Luna declared that in order to protect the power of God and the dignity of the divine messengers, she must defeat this creature. Literally the next moment, Phoenix emerged from the fire and furiously addressed his opponents. He asked them how they dared to kill his precious children. And then suddenly, a mysterious voice informed the main character that a magical power had been discovered. The protagonist noticed that Phoenix was touching his sword in a strange way, and a golden aura began to swirl around it. He imbued it with his energy and declared that he would burn them to ashes so that nothing would remain of their bones. At this moment, Luna and Colin were very surprised that this monster could use magic. At that moment, Phoenix raised his head to the ceiling and roared furiously. Circles of magical energy began to appear around him, spreading throughout the hall. Suddenly, fiery wings grew from behind his back, and he ordered his opponents to get ready. And a moment later, he rose into the air and prepared to attack Colin from above. And although the protagonist tried to defend himself, Phoenix dealt him such a powerful blow that he managed to wound him in the chest. At that moment, Colin realized that there was clearly something wrong with this magical power. Moreover, the system told him that Phoenix only had a basic level of magic, which was impossible. Then the protagonist shouted at Luna and declared that they needed to end this quickly. The girl appeared right behind the enemy and immediately struck him with both of her swords. With one deft attack, she cut through the enemy's armor. She stated that once they got his defenses down, he wouldn't be anything special. But before she could finish her sentence, Phoenix's head floated in front of her, clearly laughing at her. When the boys looked at his corpse, they saw that some kind of dark energy began to swirl around it. Gradually, it began to grow together into one complete body. When he had fully recovered, he laughed loudly and asked the boys if they really thought they had already defeated him. And then Luna realized that their enemy had just split into several knights. The protagonist noted to himself that this was a technique he had never seen before. At this moment, the knights into which the Phoenix had divided simultaneously rushed to attack the moon. Colin tried to warn her, but another knight appeared right behind him. At the last moment, the protagonist managed to use the condensation of harm, which allowed him to compress the ice and create any shape. In this way, he was able to freeze his opponent. After that, it crumbled into pieces of ice. However, Colin quickly realized that the battle was not over yet. Even though he managed to kill some copies, new ones were reborn immediately afterward. Phoenix stated that he was immortal. No matter how many times he died, he would immediately be resurrected. After this, he again attacked his opponents, calling them weak people. He used a sword technique called Shadow Blade to attack the protagonist. However, at the moment of the attack, he noticed that his opponent was no longer there. When the smoke cleared a little, he saw that in its place now stood only a block of ice. Moreover, he did not find that human woman nearby either. At some point, Phoenix even thought that these guys had simply run away from him. This made him scream in rage, and he asked if they were trying to play a joke on him. After this, he began to launch attacks in all directions, hoping to somehow hit his opponents. Meanwhile, Colin and Luna were already moving along another corridor. The girl was very badly wounded and could not fight, and the main character was not doing any better. He was still thinking about the Phoenix's characteristics and still couldn't believe that it actually had a basic level of magic. He tried to understand what exactly was happening in this place, but nothing came to his mind. And then suddenly Luna started coughing, and blood started splashing out of her mouth. The protagonist immediately sat her down so she could rest a little, but the girl said that she was fine. She smiled tiredly and apologized to Colin for not being able to be of use to him. However, the hero said that it was he who was naive, because he thought that he could defeat the enemy with divine punishment. When he looked closely at Luna's face, he realized that due to the infection, she didn't have much time left. So he asked her to stay here and rest a little, and he would fight this creature. The girl did not want to leave him alone, and said that she would also go with him. But before she could finish speaking, they both heard a strange roar that was literally above their heads. At that moment, the protagonist realized that their enemy, apparently, had found them himself. That's exactly what happened. Phoenix made a hole in the ceiling and appeared right in front of them, asking if they really thought they could escape from him. He laughed, calling his opponents incredible fools. The protagonist immediately rose to his feet and called him an incredibly persistent bug. However, he suddenly noticed something else strange that was happening not far from him. He noted that Phoenix apparently brought her cubs with her this time. In response, the beetle declared that this time he would definitely finish them off, after which he pointed his weapon forward. He ordered the reanimated corpses to attack his opponents to avenge their slain brothers. The main character immediately began to cast a spell to somehow resist this attack. He used a skill called ice condensation to create an ice shield in front of him, blocking his attacks. However, Phoenix cut it down with one swing of his sword. At this moment, the protagonist realized that the beetle was apparently trying to hide in the pair. After this, he turned to Luna, who was behind, and told her to go forward. But instead, the girl grabbed him tightly with her hands and sank her teeth into his shoulder with all her strength. The main character looked at her in horror and asked what was happening to her. The girl began to cry, but admitted that she could not bear it any longer. Apparently, the infection was already taking its toll on her. And then Colin realized that Phoenix was currently controlling the corpse bug puppets. His opponent stated that if Colin drank the potion now, it would only prolong his suffering. Then he extended his hand to him and ordered him to bow before him. At that moment, blood gushed from the mouth. He fell to the floor from exhaustion, and then Phoenix solemnly declared that he had won. He assumed that Colin was now experiencing betrayal, despair, and the bitterness of defeat. He also added that the previous owner of this body had a similar facial expression before death. At that moment, someone's terrifying paws tore through Phoenix's body and burst straight out of his chest. The monster created a huge web in which he lifted the Phoenix and asked Colin not to worry, because this pain and suffering would end. Having torn the body of the unfortunate knight apart, the monster declared that he would suck out all the blood without leaving a trace. Literally the next moment, the main character found himself wrapped in a web and suspended upside down. Meanwhile, the monster had already completely emerged from Phoenix's body and approached his new victim with a smile. Mother Zhukov said with a smile that now she could finally get out of this rotting body. Meanwhile, Duck was watching everything that was happening, noting that quite a bit of time had passed since the start of the qualifying test. However, because of the barrier, they couldn't understand what was happening inside the labyrinth, so it was difficult to say what happened to Colin. However, Sarah was firmly convinced that everything would be fine with their comrade. In her opinion, enemies of this level were just trifles for a guy like him. However, deep down, Duck doubted that everything was as simple as she thought, although he still hoped that his comrade was okay. Meanwhile, the main character was completely covered in cobwebs and even spoke a little. The Beetle Queen continued to laugh at him and said that he could consider it an honor for him. After this, she opened her mouth, revealing several rows of her sharp fangs. Her face stretched to a terrifying size, and she declared that Colin would become her flesh and blood. She stated that by his death he would contribute to the prosperity of her people. At that moment, the main character suddenly laughed and said that he really didn't want to disappoint her. After this, the beetle woman suddenly felt that her body was pierced by some sharp thorns. The protagonist declared that from today on, her family would be destroyed, and at that moment, Luna plunged her weapon into the monster. The woman looked at her in horror and asked why she was not under her control. Then the girl with a sly smile said that in fact it was just a game. All this was necessary to pull her out of the Golden Sword King's body. Zhukov's mother refused to believe that she had also been so deceived. Without giving her a chance to escape, Luna used a technique called 100 Tearing Strikes and killed the monster. Seeing this, the main character smiled contentedly, and the web around him began to tear apart. After that, he was finally able to get out of it and jump down. At that moment, the Beetle Queen's head fell down, and she continued to lament about how Colin had deceived her. She called people cowardly creatures and repeated the words about being the immortal Golden Sword King. But the hero lifted her head and declared that if he were the true king of the sword, she would not even have a chance of winning. After that, he took out his blade and asked her to stop imitating a human so cheaply. He stated that it was time for her to accept her false reality. The protagonist then stabbed her right in the eye, claiming that she was nothing but a parasite. At that moment, her face became deformed, swollen with huge blisters, and the Beetle Queen herself screamed. A moment later, all the reanimated corpses also swelled and became covered in blisters. And a second later, their bodies exploded, and soon nothing remained of them but naked skeletons. Luna even had to close her eyes to keep the green liquid that served as their blood from getting into them. However, she still got her clothes dirty, and this couldn't help but anger her. However, the girl looked back and saw something strange. She looked at the disgust with which the main character looked at her, but it turned out that she did not notice it at all. Luna, covered in green blood, ran up to him and asked if she had really been helpful. The protagonist tried to stay away from her and said that they needed to move on. On the way, Colin explained to her that they now needed to go even deeper into the building. At one point, they came across a dead end, but the hero told her that there was actually a secret room there. Luna noted that thanks to the defeat of the mother bug, the corpse bug inside her also disappeared, so she did not understand why they were going there. And in response, the main character explained to her that they were going there to pass the selection test. At first, the girl didn't understand what exactly he was talking about. Then Colin opened the secret door for her. At that moment, a bright light illuminated them, and Luna thought that the ring they were looking for was there. The hero answered her that in fact, something very important was hidden in this place. The girl did not understand what he was talking about, while the main character moved forward. When they entered inside, they saw that the whole room was filled with treasures and coins. Everywhere there were chests of jewels, expensive boxes, and heaps of gold and silver coins. Luna was truly delighted that these were real treasures. The hero explained that the proving grounds were the place where the heir to the Hall family was chosen, but it was also a place where secrets and treasures were hidden. He noted to himself that in his past life he had found this room by accident, although at that time he had been completely dead and, in addition, had failed the test. And then suddenly Colin became interested in a map that seemed to resemble a map of the dark, deep forest. Moreover, there were some other strange marks on this map. Then Colin wondered what they could mean. And then he suddenly heard that very voice and felt that magical power. Then he realized that there was definitely a secret hidden in this forest. He thought to himself that he must definitely pass this test and go into this forest to investigate. And then his attention was suddenly drawn to a strange bag that stood not far from him. The main character did not understand why there was a seemingly ordinary cloth bag lying in such a place. He picked it up and shook it in front of him, but to his regret, there was nothing inside. But when the hero looked inside, he saw that there was a magic seal right inside the bag. The system told him that it was an infinite pouch, it could store anything inside and had a blood seal effect. This unusual magical thing greatly interested the hero. He thought with a smile about how he could implement it on his journey. However, he was pulled out of his thoughts by Luna's cry, who addressed him as Mr. Clark. She excitedly declared that the ring they were looking for was nowhere to be found. The protagonist was surprised, not understanding how she could search the entire room in such a short time. Then he said that no one said that the ring would be here, and Luna was confused by this answer. Then Colin asked her to collect beautiful jewels for him, those that shone brightly even in the dark, and then she would understand what was what. Luna still didn't understand why she needed to do all this, but she still obeyed. After some time, she collected precious stones for him, hoping that this would be the key to passing the test. After that, they walked forward along the corridor. The girl noticed deep cracks in the walls and asked the hero what they would do now. He answered her that now they needed to look for the ring, and Luna asked him if he knew where it was. But to her great surprise, Colin replied that he had no idea where the ring was now, but he still had a lead on who might know where it was. He also added that this man was a true professional in his field. Sometime after this, the guys finally went outside and started making preparations. Having summoned several of his clones, the protagonist cut down one large tree. However, he realized that this was still not what he wanted. No matter how much Colin racked his brains, he couldn't reproduce the Golden Sword's attack. Phoenix was an unusual nobleman. He did not receive the blessing of magical talent and followed the path of the sword. However, Colin knew that the grimoire also contained similar magic. But all of them, without exception, were of a high level. In other words, it was not the kind of magic that Phoenix could use. Besides, this clone from the sword aura looked similar, but in terms of characteristics, it was much inferior to the Phoenix clone. Now the main character was faced with the question of what trick was behind all this. Moreover, he now had a strange thing called an infinity pouch. She also had a blood seal effect that was still unknown to Colin. He tried to convince himself that he didn't need to pour his own blood into the bag to do this. And then suddenly, an idea came into his head. He remembered what Phoenix had done with his sword and thought that he had actually been pouring his blood into it. Thinking about this, the protagonist activated a magic circle under his feet. After that, he reached for his weapon. he suddenly noticed that some strange, previously unknown energy began to hover around his blade. And then suddenly Colin felt something completely strange. Suddenly Luna came up behind him, tearing him away from his deep thoughts. Holding a small torch in her hands, the girl waved to him and addressed him as Mr. Clark. The hero looked at her with a serious look and asked what happened with the matter he asked her about. The girl said that she left all the jewelry exactly where he asked. Afterwards, she asked him what he was doing, and Colin replied that he was practicing fencing. He noted that this should have been obvious at first glance. For a while, the boys just stood there in silence, not knowing what else to say to each other. Luna asked Colin if the professional was really around here, since it didn't look like anyone could live here. And then she suddenly heard a strange sound and sharply waved her torch in his direction. She turned around and asked what just happened. In response, the hero only said with a smile that as soon as the devil was mentioned, he would immediately appear. He then threw the burning torch towards the gem, which was located not far from them. Literally the next moment, the gem melted, revealing before them the figure of a small piglet. Luna was surprised that this little boy was the very professional who would help them in finding the ring. The hero explained that it was a gem pig, a monster that had a habit of digging up and collecting treasures like gold. Luna was very surprised that such creatures actually existed in the real world. And then she remembered that they could even find treasures buried deep underground, thanks to their excellent sense of smell. However, due to their fragile and cautious nature, they were rarely seen in real life and were practically legendary. Then Luna leaned over to the little animal and wanted to pet it. She still couldn't believe that they met it in such a place. But the piglet reacted very hostilely, and Luna hastened to pull her hand away. However, she stated that they were very lucky to have found such a rare monster so easily. The hero noted to himself that, perhaps, it was still much better than what had happened in his past life. Luna then asked Colin if he was really going to ask this little guy to find the ring. In response, the protagonist said that this is what he was going to do, after which he squatted down in front of the piglet. He quietly told him that he was not really his enemy, and just wanted to make a deal with him. Colin said that if he helped him find what they were looking for, he would let him go right away. He also showed him a bag of gems, stating that he had not asked him to work for free. When the piglet saw such a huge mountain of gems, his eyes immediately lit up with delight. Colin smiled and noted that the piglet really did have an excellent sense of smell, and they took all the treasures from the mother beetle's nest. The hero then declared that if the pig did the job, he would give him 10%, which was a pretty good deal. But quite quickly, having come to his senses, the piglet immediately began to turn his head, refusing this offer. After that, he leaned forward and sniffed the gems in the protagonist's hand very carefully. He looked at the little animal in surprise, not understanding what it was doing. After this, the piglet took half of the gems and then spat them out. Colin guessed that he wanted half of them, but reminded him that they had risked their lives to collect those jewels. So he angrily declared that he would not give him more than 20%. At first, the piglet thought about such a profitable deal. Deciding that there was no point in arguing with this man, he sank to the ground and bent over his gems. Colin decided that this behavior could be considered consent. When they finally came to an agreement, he destroyed the gems that were binding the little pig's limbs. Immediately after this, the little animal ran up to Colin and climbed up his leg. Soon it was on his shoulder, and then the hero asked Luna if she remembered what the ring looked like. The girl answered a little hesitantly that she remembered it. Colin added that this guy could even sniff out other people's memories, and Luna just had to put her head on the line. However, the girl was not very keen on doing this, and suggested that the main character let the piglet smell her head. But the hero laughed it off, saying that he didn't remember what the ring looked like. In fact, he didn't want the piglet to know about his past life. Luna realized that it seemed there was nothing she could do about this situation, and she bowed her head towards the piglet. He immediately approached her and began to carefully sniff her face. And then he suddenly stopped and looked at the girl with some strange expression on his face. Immediately after this, the piglet jumped out of the protagonist's hands and ran off into the distance. He ran as fast as he could somewhere deep into the forest, apparently having sensed what they were looking for. After a while, he stopped near the bushes and looked somewhere through them. Immediately after this, he climbed a tree and began to survey the surrounding area from a high branch. At that moment, the main character realized that everything was clear to him. Then he saw that the piglet was looking at an active volcano. The hero realized that the ring was hidden there. However, they had no choice, and so, with the help of the little animal, they flew straight to the volcano. Luna was delighted. She didn't know that the gem piglets could change size and fly. After this, she turned to the little animal and asked him how much longer they had to fly. At the same time, the main character rested a little and thought about how everything was in his past life. Then the test was absolutely not easy for him. He was very seriously wounded. At some point, he encountered the girl who had seriously injured him and asked her if she had intended to kill him. The pink-haired girl in the hood squatted down in front of him and said that she really was going to do it. She leaned toward Colin and said with a smile that she had met many strong people in her life. However, in her opinion, he was her most beloved person. She licked the blood from her fingers and declared that she wanted to make Colin her personal man. But in the end, everything turned out completely differently. And then suddenly the girl screamed, asking him why he did this. She stated that if he hadn't done that thing, everything could have been different. She gently kissed the protagonist on the forehead, saying that in that case, they could be together forever. But if she still couldn't get him, then she would just leave him here to rot with the rest of the corpses. However, before leaving, the girl suddenly remembered that she wanted to tell him something. Colin looked at her with irritation, waiting to see what else she wanted to tell him. And then suddenly the girl turned to him and began talking about her name. She asked the hero not to forget her name even after his death. At this moment, Luna shook the protagonist, as he was clearly not himself. She asked him worriedly why he was so daydreaming. She then pointed to some strange ruins located near the volcano and said that they had almost arrived at the right place. At that moment, Colin wondered why he suddenly remembered his past life. But nevertheless, his thoughts were now occupied by something completely different. Looking at the ruins, he thought that now he could finally pay back for that day. Soon after, the piglet landed on a flat surface. Immediately after this, he began to exhale air from himself to change his size back to small. The sudden change in size threw our heroes off his back, and they flew to the side. Then they suddenly noticed a huge tower that stood right on this platform. Luna noted that it all looked very strange. However, the piglet did not hesitate and immediately ran straight to the base of the statue. He carefully stood up on his hind legs and sniffed the stone woman. After that, he turned to look at the main characters, and his gaze seemed to be full of delight. Luna initially thought that the ring was there, but quickly came to the conclusion that there was nothing there. But since the deal was completed, the protagonist threw him a bag of jewels that were promised to him as payment. The contented piglet immediately grabbed the bag with his lips and pulled it towards himself. Without thinking twice, he used his ears as wings again and flew away from the volcano. The protagonist said that the gem pig's sense of smell was never wrong, and there must have been some kind of trick here. And then suddenly, Luna grabbed Colin's hand and announced that she had figured out what was going on. She pointed to the statue and said that if they prayed to God, he could lend them his power. Without thinking twice, the girl immediately folded her hands and began to pray to the great God to answer her prayers. At that very moment, a magic circle appeared on the table right in front of them. Luna was delighted when she realized that God had actually responded to her prayers. In the very center of the magic circle was the very ring they had followed all this way. Luna immediately asked the protagonist to take the ring because all this time he had tried so hard for it. The girl was very happy, realizing that now her comrade would be free from the control of the Williams family. Luna added that in gratitude for him saving her, she would give him the ring this time. The protagonist understood that if he took the ring, the qualifying test would end right then and there. He was just one step away from becoming a candidate for succession. But before that, he still had one unfinished business. So he immediately pulled out his weapon and blocked the attack that was flying straight at him from behind. As it turned out, Luna took advantage of the moment and threw her dagger at the protagonist. After this, Colin pointed his sword at her and declared that it was quite a good performance. He added that she could easily deceive the old Colin, but now everything was different. So he turned to the girl by her real name, Annie, and offered to put an end to this farce. However, he decided that it was better for him to call her differently, because in reality, she was the ninth blade of the Empire. When the girl realized that her identity had finally been revealed, she couldn't help but let out a sly laugh. Annie pulled off the mask that was changing her face and said that she was sure that she was hiding well. After that, she threw the face of the fictitious person right at her feet. The girl looked at the main character with disdain and wondered where she could have screwed up. Meanwhile, those watching everything through the portals were shocked by everything that was happening. Duck couldn't believe his eyes that his friend had actually encountered the ninth blade of the Empire. However, his sister Erica stated that it was all a lie, which greatly surprised her brother. She couldn't believe that the headmaid Eva was a murderer. At that moment, Annie laughed triumphantly, thinking about how easy it would be to defeat this guy. Using her true skills, she threw her weapon at him again. But the main character was prepared for her attacks, and therefore easily repelled them with his sword. After that, he looked closely at his opponent, waiting for her next move. He rushed to attack Annie, but she managed to jump back in time and was already behind him. While in the air right next to Colin, she laughed and announced that she was right there. The protagonist immediately turned around and attacked her, but it turned out that it was just her illusion. Finding herself behind the hero, Annie said that the phrase he said to her earlier was rather weak for a pickup line. Without answering her, Colin swung his sword again, but the girl dodged this attack as well. Watching him try to hit her, she couldn't help but laugh. After this, she released several iron chains from her body, which trapped the protagonist in a cage. He began to look around, realizing that his escape route was blocked. Annie recalled his story about him being a nobleman, after which she declared that she would not let him use magic. Immediately after that, she attacked him with chains, but the protagonist deftly dodged her attacks. After that, he ducked down to lunge, but the chains were already preparing to attack him from above. But even for this case, Colin had his own plan. While the girl was expecting a direct attack from him, he threw a pile of stones at her, thereby causing her delight. She barely managed to dodge this attack, but demanded that the hero do it again. After this, Annie took advantage of the moment and rushed straight towards the main character through the stones. In just a couple of seconds, she was right in front of him and looked at him intently. Apparently, Colin hadn't expected her to be so fast. He immediately put his sword in front of him and intended to attack his opponent while she was so close. But despite the blade being literally a centimeter from her face, Annie only grinned. She grabbed the blade with her bare hand, and even though her hand was bloody, she continued to smile. She licked her lips in delight, feeling that feeling when you are standing on the brink of death. After that, she took advantage of the moment and swung her leg, which also had a blade attached to it. But Colin expected such an attack from her, and therefore dodged in time. But the girl had more tricks up her sleeve. She also hid several sharp needles in her mouth. She spat them out towards the protagonist, but he managed to dodge this attack in time. However, the battle was so intense that he was already quite exhausted. Annie, meanwhile, continued to lick the blood from her hand, clearly enjoying the process. She laughed maniacally and declared that it was absolutely brilliant. At that moment, lightning began to swirl around her, and she thanked the great god for saving her from the Reaper's scythe once again. The girl declared that she would follow his instructions and fulfill her mission. Immediately after that, she used a sword technique called Confusing Shadow. A whirlwind of wind began to swirl around the protagonist, and he could not see what was literally a meter away from him. At that moment, he thought about what Annie had just said about some kind of instruction. He quickly realized that the stone statue had put something into her head. And then he suddenly heard again that strange voice that said that he was hungry. Colin began to guess that this was also an instruction. At that moment, Annie appeared right behind him and scolded him for being in the clouds. However, Colin managed to dodge her attack in time. Watching her hair closely, he noted that it was an illusion again, not the real Annie. Before completely evaporating, the illusion asked him where his vaunted keen intuition had gone. At that moment, the protagonist realized that he was now dealing with illusions. Then he planted his foot firmly on the floor and began to carefully examine the space around him. At some point, he noticed a strange noise right above his head. As it turned out, Annie was already preparing another attack for him, but how this fight would end was still unknown.